Okay. And do I do? Oh, actually, that sounds like myself in the microphone. Oh, Dear friends and colleagues, welcome to the first side event at the UNEP Pavilion. Thank you for bearing a little bit with us when we got all this machinery up and running and getting the videos and so on, and the speakers to work. So my name is Niklas Hallberg. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator for UNEP's Climate Change Program, and I will be moderating this event today. This first event will focus on the findings of the production gap report, which is a complementary assessment of the emission gap report that UNEP has been putting out for more than 14 years. And the production gap report, it assesses the national fossil fuel production 0.5 and 2-degree compatible emission levels. We will also hear today about the just transition and how the just transition connects into the ongoing COP and how countries can deliver on a just transition. We may hear from a government representative from Colombia today on how Colombia is advancing with their effort to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and a more a new modern energy system. So today on the podium with me, we have Dr. Ploy Achakulvisut, who still is, one of the lead authors of the Production Gap Report and has been with the Production Gap Report ever since we started with the production in 2019. And Ploy is also a research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. And Sivan Karta, also from the Stockholm Environment Institute, will guide us through the just energy transition part and describe a little bit what it means and what are the insights we have so far of a just transition. So we will start with a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation by Ploy, describing the main findings of the report. But before I let over to Ploy, I would just like to stress that the Production Gap Report is a collaborative effort between the Stockholm Environment Institute, the Climate Analytics, E3G, IISD, and UNEP, and it complements, goes deeper into the emission gap report and pinpoints and demonstrates that there is a policy gap between what countries plan in their climate plans and then with their sectoral plans, such as fossil fuel production. And Floyd, could I now ask you to present to us the main findings? And the presentation is on the screen, and there is the switcher. And as the screens are quite small, if you could describe also quite in detail what's happening in those graphs that the people in the furthest back of the room may not see.
Yes. Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much, Nicholas, and thank you to you all for being here despite the 1 hour walk. So, while the global energy landscape is undoubtedly shaped by both demand and supply, our report series focuses on the latter, given its notable lack of attention in international and national climate policy making up until recent years. So, do I press this? I press this.
Point it at that light.
Oh. No.
I'll turn it on. There we go. All right.
Thank you. Sorry. All right, so to quantify the global production gap, we first identify the global pathways of fossil fuel production that would be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, shown in this figure by the purple and green lines and the respective interquartile ranges. These pathways represent total coal, oil, and gas supply intended for all non-energy and energy uses, and are informed by selected mitigation scenarios from the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. In a nutshell, these model-generated scenarios essentially chart out the most cost-effective pathways to transform our energy and land use systems to achieve net zero carbon dioxide emissions. Next, we estimate the so-called government plans and projections, or GPP pathway, shown by the red line, and this represents our estimate of the global levels of fossil fuel production being planned and projected by governments under their existing national energy outlook, strategies, and targets that are publicly available from 19 major producing countries that altogether account for around around 80% of global production. The combined production pathways are then estimated to a global pathway by looking at their projected shares of future global production as modeled by the International Energy Agency, or the IEA, under a scenario where countries fulfill their existing policies. And so the production gap is the discrepancy between the global levels of fossil fuel production under the red pathway and those consistent with the 1.5 or 2 degrees C pathways in any given year. And our analysis goes out until 2050. We also show, as you can see in this figure, the global levels of fossil fuel production implied by governments' existing climate policies and implied by governments' existing climate pledges and net zero ambitions, as shown by the solid and dashed gold lines in this figure. Finally, I want to note that fossil fuel production can be represented in many different units. When we quantify the global production gap in energy terms, that represents the most direct comparison to the model outputs of the IPCC scenarios. But in this figure, we can also aggregate across coal, oil, and gas to represent the total expected greenhouse gas emissions from the extraction and combustion of produced fuels, to quantify the production gap in units of greenhouse gas emissions for comparability with other climate assessments like the emissions gap. So our main headline finding this year is that in aggregate, governments are still planning to produce in 2030 more than double the amount of fossil fuels and would be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and 69% more than would be consistent with 2 degrees C. And as you can see in this figure, the production gap with respect to both temperature limits grows wider out to 2050. We find that the size of the overall production gap, especially relative to 2030 and the 1.5 degrees C consistent pathway, has remained largely unchanged since we began to first track it in 2019. And so, despite encouraging signs of a clean energy transition and increasing ambitions when it comes to government's net zero pledges, the persistence of the global production gap puts a well managed, rapid, and equitable energy transition at risk. And it also conflicts with government's climate commitments. The production gap can also be shown in terms of its component fuels, as plotted here in energy units in this figure. As you can see from the purple pathways in these figures, the global production of all three fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, declines substantially and rapidly between now and 2050 to stay on track with the 1.5 degree C goal. However, as shown by the red pathways, government's plans and projections would collectively lead to an increase in global coal production until 2030 and in global oil and gas production until at least 2050, which is when our analysis ends. So in 2030, government's production plans and projections would lead to around 460% more coal, 29% more oil, and 82% more gas than would be consistent with 1.5 degrees C. And as you can see in these figures as well, the disconnect between the planned and projected fossil fuel production and the levels implied by government's climate policies and pledges are also apparent across all three fossil fuels. Given that government's production targets help to influence, legitimize, and justify continued fossil fuel dependence, there is a real risk that such plans are undermining the energy transition by looking in long-lived fossil fuel infrastructure and investments. At the same time, many of these assets are now at risk of becoming stranded as the world decarbonizes and fossil fuel production targets fail to reflect falling demand and changing socio-political realities. The size and nature of the global production gap also raises the question of how it can be closed in a managed and equitable way, and hopefully we can get into that more with Shivan later. And it's beyond the scope of our analysis this year to provide differentiated pathways for different regions and countries. But informed by our 2020 production gap report and the growing literature on this topic, an equitable transition.
Just Chloe, because we can't see all the text in the back. So if you could describe through also the graph.
Yes, I will get to that.
Thank
So,
you.
an equitable transition should recognize that country circumstances differ widely depending on their financial and institutional capacity, as well as their level of socio-economic dependence on fossil fuel production. And so, in this year's production gap report, we also explore the equity implications of governments' existing plans and projections. So, in this figure, we take income level per the World Bank classification as a broad proxy for transition capacity. And we find that if we aggregate across the plans and projections of 10 high income countries alone, the levels of planned coal, oil, and gas production under the GPP pathway would already exceed the 1.5 degrees C consistent pathway by 2040. If we repeat this exercise, but group countries instead by their levels of relative economic dependence on fossil fuel production, we find that the combined production by 12 countries alone with relatively lower levels of dependence on fossil fuel production would exceed the 1.5 degrees C consistent pathways by 2040 also. And just to reemphasize, this figure shows the countries grouped by income level, with the highest income levels appearing at the bottom and going towards lower income levels towards the top. And so, without proactive engagement and discussion between parties on how to manage and share the remaining fossil fuel extraction budget, there is a risk that a global fossil fuel phase out will be highly inequitable, fail to support vulnerable communities, and further erode trust in global cooperation on climate action. And this figure is way too busy to go through in detail for such a small slide, but I just wanted to emphasize that in sections 2.3 and 2.4 of Chapter 2 this year, we explore in detail the pathways of fossil fuel production that would be aligned with the 1.5 degree C target as informed by selected scenarios from the IPCC as well as from the IEA's 2023 update of its net zero emissions by 2050 or the NZE scenario. And I just want to highlight today 3 key policy implications from this analysis. First, to keep the 1.5 degree C goal in reach, the global production and consumption of all 3 fossil fuels need to decline substantially and rapidly between now and 2050, alongside other key climate mitigation goals like scaling up renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, reducing methane emissions from all sources, including from oil and gas production. Um, and this is also true regardless of whether a given scenario relies on future large scale deployment of carbon capture and storage, or CCS, or carbon dioxide removal, or CDR measures. Secondly, the modeled reductions in coal, oil, and gas depend on and influence one another, especially in the near term. And so it's really important to set near and long term reduction targets for all 3 fossil fuels, not just focus on coal fired power generation. And finally, the pace and magnitude of the modeled coal, oil, and gas reductions are particularly sensitive to each scenario's assumed reliance on CCS and CDR, especially for gas. And so, if we were to take a more precautionary approach and only look to scenarios with relatively limited reliance on CCS and CDR, our analysis suggests that countries should be striving for, at a minimum, a near total global phase out of coal production and consumption by 2040, at a combined reduction in global oil and gas production and consumption by 75% by 2050 compared to 2020 levels. And sorry, just one thing to add. And while these long term reduction targets are informed, as I mentioned, by cost optimized scenarios, there are also other lines of evidence that suggest we should be striving for a faster phase out of coal, oil, and gas. For example, other research has found that the committed CO2 emissions from both existing fossil fuel extraction and fossil fuel combustion infrastructure would already together exceed the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget. Secondly, these cost optimized pathways don't account for the near term localized harms of continued fossil fuel dependence, such as toxic air, water, waste pollution, which affect the frontline local communities living near fossil fuel extraction sites. And so the fact that millions of people are dying prematurely, falling ill each year from air pollution stemming from fossil fuels should be another compelling reason to strive for an even faster phase out. And as I mentioned, even though we do filter for excessive reliance on CCS and CDR, these scenarios still do assume that these measures will be able to scale to some large scale capacity in the future. But we know there are lots of feasibility, sustainability concerns associated with them. And so, if they were to fail to scale up to the levels assumed in these scenarios, we would need to phase out coal, oil, and gas even more rapidly. And then in chapter three, the final chapter of our report, we profiled in more detail the 20 key producer countries that altogether account for 82% of global fossil fuel production and 73% of consumption. These two-page country profiles provide a summary of countries' existing climate ambitions against their existing plans, policies that continue to support fossil fuel production. And we also assess whether any of these countries are beginning to have discourses or policies towards a managed and equitable wind down of fossil fuel production. And so I highly encourage you to just explore each of the country profiles. We have copies of the report at the back there. I'll just summarize some of the key findings we find across all of the 20 countries. So, firstly, 17 of these 20 major fossil fuel producers have pledged to achieve net zero emissions. Many have also launched initiatives to reduce emissions from fossil fuel production activities. However, none have committed to reduce coal, oil, and gas production in line with a 1.5 degree C target. In fact, many continue to support, invest in, and plan on the expansion of fossil fuel production. In particular, many producer countries are promoting gas as an essential bridge or transition fuel, but with no apparent plans to transition away from it later. Nevertheless, there are some encouraging signs of change. We find that this year, 4 countries have begun to develop scenarios for domestic fossil fuel production that would be consistent with their national or international climate goals. And we also find that support for a just energy transition is growing, although such discourses and policies are for now mostly still limited to coal fired power generation. And so to end with, I just want to emphasize that here at COP, it's a really big year for fossil fuel phase out. And we really urge governments to implement strategies to ensure that as we phase in renewable energy, we also phase out fossil fuels so that we can have a coordinated, well managed energy transition that also has implementation plans and policies in place to help fossil fuel dependent communities and workers um, go through this transition in the most least disruptive way as possible. Avoiding talking about the issue just makes it increasingly harder and more disruptive to have to address later on. And it's really high time that we address fossil fuels production and consumption within these negotiations and beyond. And so, as I have said, we urge all governments to adopt near and longer term 1.5C aligned coal, oil, and gas reduction targets to also reduce the risk of financial stranded assets. Um, just to reiterate that our analysis suggests aiming to strive for a global phase out of coal production and use by 2040 and cutting oil and gas combined by 75% by 2050, while aiming for a phase out if CCS and CDR were to fail to scale. Um, and as I mentioned, to make sure that such a transition would be equitable, countries should also recognize their differentiated responsibilities and capabilities, whereby governments with greater transition capacity should aim for more ambitious reductions and provide finance and support for lower income countries. And finally, we would urge all governments to be more transparent in their plans, policies that continue to support fossil fuel production and how they align with national and international climate goals. So, with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank, thank you, Ploy. I've heard that presentation a number of times now, and it's still mind-boggling to me that we're at a situation where we're still planning to produce double the amount of fossil fuels with all the climate plans in place. The transition we're talking about, Sivan, indeed will require quite an effort on the just transition. There's many people across the world that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, both for their daily bread, but also governments that are heavily dependent on it for their tax revenues and running their governments, even for the resources for it. Also here at COP, just transition is a key element that we're being discussed. And in your work as a senior scientist, working looking at climate equity, gender equality, and social equity, and you've been also part of the report, especially on the just transition
That's right.
part. What are your take on
Mm.
how can we move forward? And I'll throw out a couple of questions, and you can choose which one you want to. But how does it connect to these negotiations? Are countries? Do you see that countries are already embarking on a effort to implement just transition? And are there any best practices that we can tap into?
Good question. Good questions. Um, I think before answering that question, it's useful to think about sort of the scale of the challenge. And one of the points that Ploy made that is particularly mind-boggling is that not only is production on course to hit twice as much as would be needed for a 1.5 pathway, it's even further off course than the NDCs are.
Yes.
And we give a tremendous amount of attention to the fact that the NDCs are far off course. We need to enhance ambition.
Yeah.
And we have a whole process within the UNFCCC, this ratcheting process, the global stock take, and to to come together and think about how can we ratchet up the NDCs. All of that is on the emission side
Hmm.
and the consumption side. And none of that discussion is focused on the production side, except to the extent that some countries, much of civil society, some research institutes have been pushing on that message. It's it's surprising given that the formal discussion about just transition has sort of a long legacy in the UNFCCC.
Yeah.
Even in 1992, immediately, the question of response measures came up, but it has never been taken up in sort of an earnest, good faith, productive way. Not, I mean, I think at best, often that conversation was ignored. At worst, it was sort of toxified and became an obstruction to the negotiations. So I think there's a disconnect between the level of concern and understanding and realization of the challenge on the fossil fuel production side and the extent to which it's being taken up in the UNFCCC. It's encouraging that it is starting to be taken up. It's very encouraging that last year there was a high level discussion of a high, very visible discussion about the phasing out of fossil fuel production. And so a strong expectation from a lot of civil society is that that conversation will continue this year and hopefully some progress will be made.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that we see, you know, positive examples or it's it's less so within the formal negotiations than it is in small and somewhat piecemeal experiments in different countries. There are a few examples of countries doing something that arguably is very similar to what the trade union movement has been asking for since the 80s when they raised the issue of just transition, which is to think about just transition policies that is very much grounded in a democratic participatory process of social dialogue.
Okay.
Bring in the affected stakeholders, bring in the workers, bring in the communities, bring in associated um, um, uh, sectors and industries and the industries that would sort of need to take up the slack. And so that conversation has helped not only raise awareness, but also raise awareness of the breadth of the issue. That it's not just an issue of a particular trade, and their jobs need to be somehow managed. Um, in many countries, it's a much, much broader and economy-wide issue. An important point that you made, Troy, is that different countries have really widely different levels of dependence on fossil fuel production. And I think that that isn't fully appreciated by many people who are kind of observing from afar. On the fossil fuel emissions or consumption side, we kind of all know that we're dependent. This is a fossil fuel driven world.
Yeah.
But on the fossil fuel production side, there are much more radical disparities. One of the striking points that you flashed up there quickly is that it's the United States whose production is set to grow the most over the coming decade. The single country with the greatest expansion of fossil fuel production. And yet, the United States is not by any means the country that's most economically dependent or socially dependent on fossil fuel production. The United States gets less than 1% of its public revenue from fossil fuel production. But there are other countries, such as Iraq and South Sudan, that get nearly 90% of their public revenue from fossil fuel production. And so that means all of the government services, teachers and doctors and all of these public services are deeply entangled with the production of fossil fuel. So the idea of a transition for such countries is much more encompassing and much more challenging. And so while we may have some examples of sort of the first steps toward a just transition in some countries, there are others in which we need to think on a much broader, much more comprehensive scale. How can we invest in new industry so there can be an entirely new tax base in the economy to support the public sector? How can we think of, sort of retooling education so people getting trained for different sectors? Um, in some countries, like the UAE, um, the the labor force is so sort of it's shaped by fossil fuels. The wealth in the country comes from fossil fuel production. Most of the labor force is immigrant laborers. And so how does that all change if fossil fuel production were decline? So these are challenges that I would say there have not been examples of trying to address
Okay.
them.
Well, okay. So what I'm taking from that is that I kind of hear that there is something bubbling there already that we're more and more discussing about this.
Thankfully, yeah.
We haven't really cracked the nut yet.
We
That
haven't
we have a
scratched the
long way
surface.
to
Yeah.
go. So there's about 20, 25 people in the room. How could they help us to advance this topic at here at COP, but also at home in their organizations?
Uh,
Is there any guidance you could give? What should they go out and talk about now over the next few days?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure that of the people in the audience, some are from countries that produce fossil fuels and some are not. And I think a really important message is that this is not only relevant to countries that produce fossil fuels, that this is relevant to all countries,
Hmm.
because what's needed is not a number of independent just transitions that are constrained within the national boundary. The issue of international cooperation to enable a globally just transition is absolutely critical, because I don't think that a just transition will happen if it's not thought of as a global cooperative effort that takes real support, real institutional cooperation, political cooperation, and technological cooperation, and cooperation in terms of flows of investment and finance. All of the same issues that arise on the emission side and in adaptation and in loss and damage definitely arise on the fossil fuel production side. So one message, I guess, would be that in thinking about in your own countries what can be done, one of the most important questions I would say for non-fossil fuel producing countries is what can we do to support countries that need to undergo this transition?
Okay. Thank you, Siva. I think that is a good piece of good advice. So don't just think that it's somebody else's problem. We're in this together. If we want countries, the economy to shift away from fossil fuel, we all have to help in chipping in and making that transition, whether it's investing in renewables or coming up with alternative livelihoods. So we have just 7 minutes left, and I would like to see if there's anybody that would have a question. Otherwise, I got a page full of questions here still for Ploy and Sivan. But anybody that have any questions that you would like to ask, and Misha, or actually, I can see a microphone is moving already, and kindly mention your name and organization.
A very quick one. If it's too hard, skip it. Ray Muslin, the International Actuarial Association. Um, how do things like biofuels and some of the replacement fuels for fossil fuels that can create water use problems and other things factor into your analysis, or is it not considered?
That's a great question. I mean, these pathways do consider how all sources of energy, including biofuels, will scale in the future. So they have very varying assumptions. Some have quite substantial bioenergy as a fuel source, but also then to see it tied to CCS and to help as a carbon dioxide removal method. I think given that um, some of them don't actually always lead to carbon neutral or net zero emissions. They might be useful as transition fuels or to help deal with really hard to abate, hard to transition sectors. But that ultimately striving for renewable energy, scaling up battery storage systems, um, and making sure that as we go into this, what some researchers have called a mid transition, where we have this coexistence of fossil fuel energy systems, clean energy systems, biofuels, alternative fuels, that we don't lose sight of the goal of not locking in continued fossil fuel dependence, and ultimately striving to get to net zero, really just zero CO2 emissions as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Ploy, as well for the answer. Any other questions that we have? Sorry.
Oh, the
Oh,
minister
oh,
from.
the minister.
Splendid, splendid.
Oh,
I'll do this.
okay. Uh, Sophie, may you join us?
Hi. Good.
Hi, welcome. Uh, yes, so we have a few minutes left. We're very happy that the Minister of Mines and Energy of in Colombia was able to join us. So if there was a question still on the floor, I'm gonna go to the minister now for his quick reflections on how Colombia manages the complex transition away from fossil fuels to a new energy system and all the difficulties in that. We would like to hear how can it be done? And the minister will do his intervention in Spanish, and we will do a translation of it. Uh, and Misha, oh, if we could get the mic, then for the translation for Sophie here. I think we all have been running around the
Yes.
compound and trying to find the places. So it is a difficult one.
Yes.
Well, getting in our exercise today.
Good morning.
Yes.
Excuse me. Bueno, llegué un poco tarde debido a que hay que dar muchas vueltas en el sitio para encontrar este lugar.
So he says sorry. Say sorry that it took him a little bit of time to arrive because it was a little bit difficult to find his way because of everything black.
Pero afortunadamente ya estamos aquí.
But he's happy to be here now.
Entonces voy a aprovechar los minutos que nos quedan en este espacio para contarles un poco lo que estamos haciendo en Colombia.
So he's going to make the most of these few minutes to talk a little bit about Colombian experience.
En primer lugar, a propósito de la discusión de el informe, desde Colombia estamos en un trabajo desde el gobierno que hemos denominado el cierre de la frontera extractiva.
So from a Colombian perspective, the way they are like approaching the negotiation is that they are closing the production gap and the
Y
extraction.
es parte de la discusión que tenemos en el mundo, cómo logramos hacer una transición que no solo es energética, sino que para muchos de nuestros países que somos productores de petróleo, gas, significa una transición económica.
So it's part of the discussion that Colombia is supporting, that we need to transition away, but also look at the economic and
the economic implications of the transition, because they are a production country, and being a production country, they have to look into the implications to the economy of this transition.
En ese sentido, hemos venido trabajando para transformar la canasta de exportaciones del país. Nuestra dependencia es de un 40-50% exportaciones de hidrocarburos y es parte de lo que debemos transformar para lograr dar pasos en la lucha contra el cambio climático y la transición energética.
So in this regard, like they are like looking at reducing from 40 to 50% of the production, and this is part of the action they are taking on climate.
Es por eso que hemos venido presentando a nivel internacional la campaña de Colombia, el país de la belleza.
Okay, that's why they are coming here and showcasing this international campaign that they call Colombia, the country of beauty.
Para ir transformando las fuentes de ingresos del país y que nos permita económicamente transformar y hacer algo que el mundo está debatiendo, que es la descarbonización de la economía.
So that's why they are using the so they are like changing their income sources from the production of oil and gas to
actually expand the income and the tax revenues from other sources, because otherwise it won't be possible for them to do the transition, because they are between 40 to 50% based on revenues from fossil fuels, which goes along what you were saying, and therefore it's not an easy endeavor.
Entonces, si bien la discusión en países como el nuestro, que no tiene unos grandes porcentajes de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero, sí tenemos las consecuencias del calentamiento global y por eso nos corresponde tomar medidas.
So, I mean, while Colombia, they are not like one of the biggest emitter, they still want to take action to reduce their emission.
Y pues estamos en ese proceso de cerrar la frontera extractiva, buscar otras fuentes de ingresos y a propósito de eso, implementar energías renovables, nuevas tecnologías para dar ese tránsito económico que requiere el país.
So that's why like they are like shifting and sorry, they are like reducing like the extraction. I mean, what they call is like they are like closing the border to extraction, and they are looking at alternative like renewables.
Y pues es un proceso que muchos países estamos intentando dar, pero precisamente en estos espacios es importante hacer el llamado de que los países que estamos dando los pasos necesitamos también mucho apoyo, mucha ayuda internacional para lograr hacer esta transformación.
So I think the main part that is saying that I mean they are ready to take action, but they need support to make sure that they can do this transition. And countries like Colombia need this support to be able to, I mean, to ensure that they transition away from fossil fuels.
Nuestro presidente Gustavo Petro ha lanzado una propuesta al mundo de acción climática por deuda.
So his president,
Gustavo Petro.
Gustavo Petro, put together like this proposal. I think it's on debt swap
De acción climática
on climate action.
para poder financiar esta transición.
In order to finance the transition.
Así que todos los países que estamos dando estos pasos requerimos de una discusión sobre las finanzas globales, de tal manera que podamos transformar nuestras economías y de esa manera tener un aporte decidido frente a lo que implica la lucha contra el cambio climático.
So all these countries that are going through this transition are like asking for this discussion on finance in order to be able to implement like their commitment on climate action.
Dejaré allí y hacemos preguntas.
Okay,
He's asking if
excellent.
there's any question.
Excellent. I'm first gonna, and thank you, Excellency, for running here and joining us today, and also for being a leader, taking on that role. I think there's, yes. Okay, I would have a question here, but I'm also going to look if there is anybody from the audience that would like to have a question, and especially now for the minister from Colombia on this transition that probably will not be an easy one, both politically and also just technically how you shift to a more widened economy. Any questions? Going once, going twice? Okay, so then I'm gonna ask the question. Politically, is it possible to over multiple political cycles to maintain this energy transition that you plan to undertake?
Una parte. Parte de la discusión implica un consenso social, un consenso político,
So,
que
so part of the discussion implies a political and social consensus.
en nuestro país hemos logrado un consenso sobre la necesidad de la transición energética justa.
So in Colombia, they reached this consensus in terms of social consensus to this just energy transition.
Entiendo que hay muchos países donde aún hay debates sobre la necesidad o no de una transición energética y ecológica.
I mean, in many countries, they are still like debating whether they should do this energy transition, just energy transition. But in their case, they already like reached social consensus.
Así que considero que la base es un acuerdo social, un acuerdo político, y ahora estamos en una discusión sobre la manera, cómo lograr esa transición.
So it's just saying that the basis is just to have this political and social consensus, and now like they are discussing how to make it happen.
En particular, nuestro gobierno, que tiene un año de ejercicio,
And in particular, it's a government that just has been in place since 1 year.
tenemos el propósito de acelerar todo el proceso de transición, y esas velocidades tienen diferencias políticas.
So it's like accelerating this just energy transition, but how fast you go depends of the different political decision that needs to take place at the country level.
Por lo pronto, en nuestro ejercicio de gobierno estamos intentando demostrar que sí es posible acelerar el proceso de transición.
And they are like showing that it's possible to accelerate this transition.
Si logramos dar ese paso y garantizar que la velocidad sea correcta, creo que podemos ir avanzando en ese consenso social.
Okay. If they succeed to the speed that they want, they feel that they are able to respond to the social consensus.
Así que tenemos el reto de demostrar que es posible y que las cosas están ocurriendo.
So they have the ambition to make sure that to showcase that it's possible and that it's happening already.
Excellent. Thank you for those, and it's great to hear that that you see progress and that it's a society-wide effort to transition away from fossil fuels.
Thank you.
And with that, we have gone a few minutes past our time, but thank you for those that have organized this pavilion, that you left a buffer between the various side events. So thank you, Your Excellency, Dr. Ratchakul-Vishut and Dr. Karhan. Very nice having you on the panel. And colleagues, please come back for the next side events at UNEP. We will continue today focusing on fossil fuel, and the next one will focus on methane, which is also a key element that we need to phase out in our energy system. Thank you so much. Sorry. Thank you. Yes. Okay. And still a reminder that there are copies of the production gap report in the back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Picture?
Thank you.
Yeah, let me take a video.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon. We're just going to wait a few more minutes to allow our last speakers to come. Can shout. Colleagues, thank you for your patience. We are just going to wait a few more minutes and then we will get started. Thank you for your patience. We'll be with you in a few minutes. Thank you.
Hello. I am Fred Krupp, President of the Environmental Defense Fund. Welcome to the most important meeting of the entire COP. Thank you for finding us. You know, cutting methane is the fastest way that we can start saving the world. All right, there may be a little hyperbole in there, but not that much, because nothing will slow the increase in global temperatures in the decade ahead faster than cutting methane pollution, which makes the topic of this session so important. How do we do it? Our focus today is going to be on the technology and the science, which is how my organization, the Environmental Defense Fund, started on its methane journey 10 years ago. By then, methane was not really on the agenda as a gas that was even recognized as a climate pollutant, certainly not by the public. And we started out by finding out what we didn't know. We did a series at first of 16 studies with university partners from around the United States to find out how much methane was escaping from the oil and gas sector. And what we found out is that way more methane was coming out than was being reported or estimated. More recently, we've pushed the science further by building a satellite. We call it Methane Sat. And this will give us unparalleled ability to track sources of emissions, large and small. And its data will be available to every human being on the planet who has access to the internet. I'm super proud of this work, but I'm even more proud that now there's a growing community of people around the world dedicated to this task. And we're going to hear from some of the most important ones today, leading experts who are making possible this new era of accountability, and energy ministers who are standing up and embracing the methane challenge. From the IMEO methane data platform to the satellite carbon mapper to the work of UNEP, we really have some of the best experts with us today. And that's good because when you're facing an invisible gas that's present everywhere, coming from millions of sources, we're going to need all the help we can get to solve this problem. So, the data is going to be so important because it's going to be what enables advocates and activists and companies and countries to actually reduce methane emissions. At COP, commitments make headlines, but what's really important is delivering on those commitments. And what you're going to hear about today, the technical work, which isn't always what makes the headlines, but is so important. So let me describe how we're going to proceed today, which is first, we're going to hear from the executive director of UNEP, Inger Anderson, and then we're going to have a keynote address delivered by His Excellency, Mr. Bolarbe Abbas Lual, the Minister of the Environment in Nigeria, and a global methane pledge champion. And then the main findings of IMEO's annual report will be delivered by Ms. Excuse me. The main findings of the annual report will be delivered by Ms. Giulia Farini, the transparency lead at UNEP's IMEO. Ms. Farini will also present the first public data available from UNEP's methane alert and response system, MARS, which will be available via a beta version of IMEO's methane data platform. And then we'll have a panel discussion, and I'll introduce the panelists at that point. So let me turn to first to the keynote address from His Excellency, Mr. Bolarbe Abbas Gual. Welcome.
So thank you very much. I thought I'll go there. I'll take this here. That's all right. Thank you very much. I, I will start by apologizing for coming a little late because I was throughout the day with my president. So we had to go for the family photograph for the opening ceremony that just finished around 2 o'clock. So I had to virtually run here because I consider this very important to me. This is the most important engagement that I've been invited for because most of the engagements are for my president, but this is the one that I consider very important, and that's why I'm here because I consider UNEP very important. They have done a lot for us. In fact, we are now in an engagement with them, trying to address the issues of degradation around the oil fields in Nigeria. So UNEP has been quite supportive. They've been there for almost 5 years. So whenever they invite me anywhere, I will try to be there if it means running down there. Thank you very much. The MC has already established the protocol, so I will just go straight because I think we've taken a lot of time. I'm supposed to be here at 2 o'clock. It's almost like 12. I'm 2:20. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, uh, esteemed guests, data innovators, and climate visionaries. I'm highly honored and delighted to deliver this remark at this very important gathering of the launch of panel taking place here at COP28. Let me appreciate the foresight and the initiative of the organizers of this event, a Methane Data Revolution, the road to radical transparency. There is no better time than now to collectively come together as one voice to discuss and seek solutions to save our ecosystem from methane emissions. Recognizing global effect of methane emission as a major contributor to the rising concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it becomes imperative to treat cautiously in preventing measure in bring up preventive measures to regulate the emissions of methane. Measures to reduce methane emission will certainly provide benefits to mitigating the effect of climate change. For this end, there is the need to accurately collate and process data on the emission and mitigation. With ongoing work of the International Methane Emission Observatory, IMEO, in advancing methodologies for transparent data collection, I am optimistic that this will provide sustainable solution for transparent reporting on methane emissions that will support proposed action for the reduction of methane emission at global, regional, and national levels. I would like to this medium to appreciate UNEP and, and affiliate organization, Climate and Clean Air Coalition, CCAC, and Clean Air Task Force, CATF, for supporting the development of Nigeria's National Action Plan. National Action Plan to reduce short-lived climate pollution, SLCPS, in 2019. This plan provides guidelines for reducing methane in the oil and gas sector. Dear person, I'm happy to inform you that Nigeria is committed to methane emission reduction join the global methane initiative at regional level in 2019, and sign the global methane pledge in Glasgow at COP26. So we have already signed the pledge in Glasgow 20 at COP 2026, and we are still abiding by that. Recognizing several opportunities and energy potentials in the methane conversion provides, I request this forum to explore opportunities and possible partnerships to support developing countries like Nigeria and others for this purpose. Finally, I would extend my appreciation to panelists, partners here present, and every individual contributing in this laudable initiative. Your dedication is a beacon of hope for a future where radical and data transparency transform our world for the better. In conclusion, let us launch this event with a shared commitment to harnessing the power of data for a more sustainable and transparent tomorrow. Thank you very much. So this is my short speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so now the Executive Director of the United Nations Environmental Program, who's arrived, Inger Anderson.
All right, thank you. This one.
Okay. Can I first thank Minister from Nigeria and, of course, my friend, Minister from Iraq. It's a pleasure to have such distinguished and senior presence in the humble UNEP home. But we're very, very grateful for the leadership of Nigeria, of Iraq, complex settings, many challenges, but a determination for which we salute you. Thank you. Really, what I think we have to understand is that emissions globally, and we just heard in the opening from the Secretary General and from Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, that emissions are not going in the right directions. UNEP's emissions gap report shows us that we are heading to the 2.9 degree world in 2100, and that if we then take on top of that the NDCs, the promises that we made each other, if there is enough money, the conditional NDCs, then we are heading for 2.5 degrees in 2100. That's not a world we want to live in. Right now, we're living in the 1.1 degree world, 1.2 degree world. And so this is not where we are wanting to be. In a sense, the bathtub is full. We can't, and for the water to is already starting to overflow at 1.1 degrees. If we continue pouring water into it, we will just get more quote unquote proverbial flooding, droughts, fires, harvest failures, etc. And the fossil fuel energy sector has some real opportunities here. And the methane is the easiest to do, fastest to grasp real impact. It's everything we do in the fuel sector, hydrocarbon sector is complicated, but methane is something we can tackle. And if we do it right, then we can have on the short term, because these are long-lived pollutants, a real decrease while we do the decarbonization of our economies. We grab that methane and ensure that that is not emitted. And so we have to have this goal of 30% off methane emissions by 2030. And we have to be clear, though, methane emission reduction alone is not a get out of jail free card. It is a step, an important step that I am so proud that these two countries and others, I hasten to add, are making. And this is where I think the IAEA, our friends at the International Energy Agency, ourselves, and the UNEP-hosted CCAC report shows that if we do this right, then we're also going to avoid 1 million premature deaths from ozone exposure. We're going to prevent 90 million tons of crop losses. We're going to have 85 billion hours of lost labor that will not happen because we're going to do this right. And obviously, it will provide enormous economic benefits. So this is really an opportunity. And therefore, we are incredibly pleased to be with you and with the UNEP-hosted CCAC and the International Methane Emissions Observatory as core partners. And I salute everyone from all agencies who are there. In addition, the International Methane Emissions Observatory of IMEO is very important. And this is where we're funding the scientific campaigns to fill the knowledge gaps. We understand very well that methane accountability is critical. And we have so far over 100 companies in UNEP's oil and gas methane partnership, which we call 2.0 because it's stretching even more. And so today's launch of the Mars data is really an opportunity to connect to real action. And so with Mars, we very much hope that the International Methane Observatory will be able to lift up the pledge and have more coming in. So let me again salute Minister of Iraq, Minister of Nigeria. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir, because you're newly appointed. We should congratulate you on your appointment. We really salute you for your leadership, and we very much thank you for that. Thank you. And my apologies for being late.
So Giulia Farini.
Thank you, Your Excellency Fred and Inger, for your remarks. Radical transparency and the upcoming methane data revolution. This is what I want to cover today and report how UNEP, through IMEO, the International Methane Emissions Observatory, is helping make that happen. Today, UNEP is proud to launch the third annual report of IMEO and also the beta version of IMEO Methane Data. It's a public data platform. So where are we on the road to radical transparency? 8 years ago, when the Paris Agreement was ratified, methane was nowhere near the top of the global climate agenda. Only a handful of countries had methane policies and regulations in place. Very few, if any, companies were committed to reporting methane emissions, and there was no mainstream discussion of an ecosystem of satellites. The pace of change has been remarkable. Political momentum has grown with over 150 countries signing the Global Methane Pledge under the leadership of the European Union and the United States. We have 120 companies committed to measuring and reporting methane emissions. And IMEO draws data from roughly a dozen methane detecting satellites, with more on the way soon, notably EDF's MethaneSat. This sea change is driving a methane data revolution. Tapping into this revolution is essential if we want to deliver the methane reductions that humanity needs to avoid the worst impact of climate change. The science is clear. Under any decarbonization scenario, we need to reduce methane emissions if we want to keep climate stability within reach. And methane emissions deliver powerful co-benefits, as our colleagues of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition have underscored. IMEO's annual report unpacks how the methane data revolution has the potential for cutting emissions at speed and scale. But data alone is insufficient to solve the crisis we're facing. IMEO exists to bridge the gap between data and action by providing open, reliable, and actionable data to the individuals who can act to reduce methane emissions. We're building the infrastructure to turn credible data into concrete action, data into action. And today we're proud to launch the beta version of IMEO Methane Data, our public data platform. This is where all our global data will be made available to the public. We're starting with the fossil fuel sector. And as the methane data revolution unfolds, it will enable IMEO to provide other data products like the Methane Supply Index, made possible by increasingly powerful satellites and by enhanced reporting by the companies. The Methane Supply Index will quantify methane emissions associated with specific supply chains. And so it will enable gas import markets like the EU and Japan to differentiate between regions with high or lower methane content. We anticipate that this will become fully operational between 2025 and 2027 when the necessary data, empirical data, becomes available. But the first case studies will already happen in 2024. Today, though, the platform features data, public data from the Methane Alert and Response System, or MARS. MARS is the world's only public system that connects detections from multiple satellites with notifications to companies and governments. So what are the news from Mars? We launched it at COP27, and it's its pilot phase. Mars notified stakeholders of 127 major emitting events. And by major, we mean abnormal events, over 1,000 kilograms an hour. We're working in collaboration with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, the International Energy Agency, and partner countries like Iraq to empower stakeholders to cut emissions. But I want to share one success story from Mars. This is from Argentina. In the spring, IMEO through Mars detected large methane emissions in Argentina. We immediately notified the government on the origins of the methane emitting event. The government acted swiftly, notified the operators. In this case, it was ruptured tubes at one side that caused it to unknowingly leak methane emissions. Because the issue with methane is that in most cases, operators don't know that methane emissions are happening. And so the operator repaired the leak and implemented a leak monitoring plan to ensure that there were no future emissions. And in fact, we've been following these sites through Mars, and this is the difference between the pre-Mars notification and the post-Mars notification. In this year's annual report, you'll also find an update on UNEP's flagship oil and gas reporting and mitigation program, the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0. This is the world's only comprehensive measurement-based reporting framework. It requires companies to adopt 5-year methane reduction targets and to report their emissions at an unprecedented level of accuracy and granularity, both from operated and non-operated assets across the whole supply chain. The goal behind the GMP is not data, of course, it's action. It's, again, translating data into action. It experienced tremendous growth. We today have 120 companies that together represents 40% of the global oil and gas production and over 70% of LNG flows. And the good news from this year's report is that companies are moving away from estimates, from generic emission factors, and embracing real-world data, empirical measurement-based data at source level. That is what we call level 4. And they are heading towards level 5, which is the reconciliation of source level measurement-based data with site level measurements. And this is where everyone needs to be if they want to be gold standard reporting. Now, the less good news is that there is still a data gap between operated and non-operated assets. And why is this important? Let me illustrate this with one example from one of our member companies that compared measurement-based inventory with inventory based on emission factors. And guess what? The measurement-based data revealed twice the number of emissions and in totally different places. Now, beyond satellites and reporting from companies, IMEO is also conducting methane science studies that are helping drive the methane data revolution. We are conducting 34 studies across the globe, and these include the first major multi-scale measurements happening in the Middle East. That's number 25 in the map. In Oman, we're measuring emissions from oil and gas and waste. And Sub-Saharan Africa, number 14 in the map, in Angola and Gabon, we are addressing the lack of data from Africa's offshore sector. We're also initiating a series of baseline studies that will create empirical data across all sectors in specific countries. One of such countries is Nigeria, and we're very happy to partner with them. And we're also focusing on other sectors like the steel supply chain, because methane from met coal that is used in the production of steel accounts for 30% of the climate footprint of steel. Now, and I'm concluding shortly, as action on methane also depends on putting the data in the right hands, we're also working with governments, helping them to translate methane data into action. We've conducted 39 trainings in over 25 countries and trained 650 individuals. To conclude, as technology advances and political momentum grows, the methane data revolution is unfolding, enabling climate progress. Challenges remain to bridge methane gaps, especially for non-operated assets. Companies will need to back their commitments with credible data and will also, of course, need to fix the emissions. Mars is a powerful tool of IMEO's data to action model. It's empowering countries and companies to achieve the world's methane targets. Now, a methane revolution can hardly be described in 10 minutes, so I encourage you to read the IMEO annual report to find out more. Thank you very much for your attention.
Um, Sorry for the technical difficulty. So we're now going to call to the stage our three panelists. First, they can all come up. Dita Jorgensen from the EU, the Director General of the Directorate General for Energy. Dita? Thank you. And also Rick Duke from Deputy Special Envoy for Climate from the Office of the U.S. Special Envoy for Climate. Thank you, Rick. And also the Minister of the Environment from Iraq, Nizar Mohammed Saad Amiti. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I guess, Dita, my first question would be for you, because the European Union has just moved impressively and announcing new regulations for methane emissions. So, what is the relationship between all of this data we've been talking about so far and the regulations?
Thank you for the question and thank you for the invitation. This is such an important event because we have come quite a long way on reducing methane emissions already. We've got the global methane pledge that the US and EU launched jointly 2 years ago. But then we need, of course, to take action to make it happen. And so that's where our focus is. As you said, we have just literally just 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks ago, reached agreement on the European regulation on methane. And I think the key point when you ask about why is the methane data revolution, what does it matter here? What's the impact of that? And essentially, if you want to reduce something, you need to be able to measure it. You need to know how much is there so you can compare what are the current methane emissions, how far can we bring them down, and how do we bring them down? So you need that measurement, you need that data in order to be able to take meaningful and effective action to lower methane reduction. So that is the connection. And that's partly what our regulation is about, our European methane regulation. It addresses both our domestic methane emissions and then it looks at what we import because we are not big fossil extractors in Europe. But we do import fossil energy, so it's also important what is the methane that is contained in what we import. At home in Europe, we establish requirements for monitoring and verification to make sure that everyone has to align with the same standard and that the measurement and the verification that is credible and data-based. So again, data is absolutely critical. And similarly for imports, we are going to ask that exporters will make sure that they also live up to these standards in terms of data availability, measuring by satellites, really to have the correct data for methane emissions, so that we know when we import fossil, then we know what is the methane content, what is the impact on the climate, how significant is that, and try to import the cleanest possible fossil for as long as we still need fossil in the system. We're working to phase out fossil, but it is still an important part of the global energy system and of the European energy system. And so as long as it is, we need to make sure that the methane is reduced as much as possible, and we need to make sure we have the data so that we can do that in the best possible way.
Thank you very much. So, Rick Duke, I want to turn to you. The Global Methane Pledge, which you were instrumental to starting, has grown enormously over the past couple of years with all the countries, over 130 countries now signing. What's the relationship between data and the Mars system that we've just talked about, and having countries actually meet those commitments of a 30% economy-wide reduction by 2030?
Thank you, Fred. And of course, no organization has been more at the forefront of tackling methane emissions than EDF. And so we appreciate your leadership over a period of decades, really, in putting this on the agenda. We are thrilled to see, actually at this point, over 150 countries in the Global Methane Pledge committed to the shared global objective of cutting methane at least 30% by 2030. And that's the minimum that the science says is needed to keep a safer 1.5 degree centigrade future within reach. And so we're working in earnest with partners to convert from putting this higher on the agenda together at COP26 and last year in Sharm to now really translating that into action and implementation. And I want to encourage everyone to tune in tomorrow at 3:45 for a methane and non-CO2 summit co-hosted by China, the United States, and the United Emirates, where there will be important news made on national actions to address methane, on mobilization of methane finance, and on really recognizing the importance of having all governments join China and the United States in making sure that they have economy-wide all greenhouse gas nationally determined contributions in the Paris Agreement, as China just indicated it would do a few weeks ago in the Sunnyland statement bilaterally with the United States. In terms of the methane alert and response system, it is really welcome news to see the Mars program up and running in full now through the International Methane Emissions Observatory, because as Dita indicated, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so having IMEO there to make sure that we're properly integrating and utilizing methane data for methane action is tremendously exciting. And Mars is a very specific way to tackle this problem. There are about 8 million tons of methane from super emitter releases in the oil and gas system globally every year. And if you look at that on a 20-year climate basis, that's over 600 million tons of CO2 equivalent that can be identified in time to do something about it. And that's precisely what the Mars system is now in place in order to make happen. So fantastic to see Mars playing its critical role in really making good on the Global Methane Pledge promise. But we also, of course, welcome the broader work of IMEO as a core implementing partner to the Global Methane Pledge in the broader question of how do we take data on methane and convert it into real reductions across not just the fossil sector, but also the waste and agriculture sector ultimately as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Rick. So I want to turn to the minister, and I know earlier Inger Anderson said that climate change is really hard, and methane is relatively the easiest, but I know methane is hard in of itself, and I want to acknowledge your good work. How are you envisioning harnessing this data to drive those actions in Iraq?
Well, thank you very much. My gratitude to the UN Environment, representing by the head of Mrs. Inger Anderson, and the Clean Air and the Climate Coalitions, and Excellencies, all the attend distinguished guests. I think it's a very important event. And really, we highly appreciate the efforts in the field of reduction of methane emission. As all of us know that my country is one of oil producing countries, and we depend mainly in our economy on oil production. And there is a great effort from my government, especially the government of His Excellency Mohammed Shia Sudani. They pay a great attention to the field of associated gas. And previously, the flare is one of the most our serious challenges that we are faced. But now we are start a great steps in order to utilize these flare in order to improve our targets in a clean and sustainable energy, in addition to utilize the great finance resources that has been previously built, so that we are working hard now in association and cooperation with many international sites, uh, and it's a great honor for us to make some support from your side in order to achieve many challenges that we are faced, because my country is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world towards the climate change, and in the field of mitigation reduction, I think we have a very realistic supreme policy towards the climate change, which is the national determined contribution. And because of our efforts and our real policy, we exceed even our governmental commitment, which is in our NDC, which is 1 to 2%. Now, I can assure you that we exceed these governmental commitment by many projects that my government has been established, and there is a huge progress in this field. We all know that the flare is not only effect on the what's called the boiling of the planet, because His Excellency the Secretary General, I think we are exceeding the terms of warming of the planet towards the boiling of the planet, and all the efforts till now, it's not efficient in order to make some sort of a real policy to support the developing and underdeveloping countries. And really, my government, as an technical Iraqi team responsible for following the issue of climate and issue of mitigation and adaptation, we put in our consideration that we put a lot of efforts in order to make some sort of a global conference that we should support the most vulnerable countries in the world, especially that countries that pay great efforts in order to have a gradual transition toward improving their infrastructures to make diversification of their economy. And the international community, especially the developed countries, should support those people who are the victims of much more than 300 years of their industrial activities that they are responsible according to Paris Agreement, the paragraph 6 for which is under the commitment of under the terms of common but differentiated responsibility. So that I think the Dubai COP28 is very important station in the long journey of climate actions. There is a huge and good progress. Ministry of Oil in my country, with many projects now proceeding and established in order to utilize, and we have a strategic national strategy. The satellite image and the satellite technology, it's a very important for us in order to improve our infrastructure. Capacity building for our people is also very important. And just I want to know to explain that we have many projects and we have a will and on the governmental level to make an, a great infrastructures in my country, reaching this to the what's called the diversification of our economy under the terms of a green sustainable economy, that we make a gradual transition towards the renewable energies and the nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oh, thank you, Minister. This has been fascinating. Thanks to each of our panelists, all of the speakers. And as we come to a close, I leave you with this fact, which is that the methane emissions in 2023 or 2024 will warm the planet about as much as all the CO2 burned from all the fossil fuels planet-wide in the next decade. That's how important methane is. So we cannot solve the climate problem without driving down methane emissions. And we cannot drive down methane emissions without accountability. And we can't have accountability and transparency without data and the technology that gives us the data.
Yes.
You've just gotten a little glimpse of how important this is. Thank you so much for coming to the most important event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fred.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for making time to join us. And of course, a special welcome to our colleagues who are joining us online. good afternoon, good morning, and a good evening to you as well. My name is Rolf Fayed, and I'm the Executive Secretary of three international conventions dealing with chemicals and waste. The Basel Convention dealing with transboundary movement of waste, the Stockholm Convention dealing with persistent organic pollutants, and the Rotterdam Convention dealing with information exchange in relation to both pesticides and industrial chemicals. Today we have a very exciting panel here. I have three of our colleagues here joining us in person, and then two will be joining us online. So allow me to introduce colleagues who are here in person. I have first start with Ms. Ruth Dokuto, who is the OIC Chief Energy and Climate Branch, Industry and Economy Division in the United Nations Environment Program. Welcome.
Thank you.
Then I have Mr. Nicola Rega, who is the Executive Director, Climate Change and Energy of the European Chemical Industry Council, or CEFIC, and who is speaking today on behalf of the International Council of Chemicals Association, or ICCA. Welcome. And of course, we have on my right-hand side, Ms. Lisa Kopek-Waluk, who's the Vice Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. Welcome. And then online, we have Her Excellency, Mrs. Yodaka Rodika Yodanov, and colleague Ms. Monica Stankiwais, Executive Secretary of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. So a big welcome to our panel members. So we don't have a lot of time, so without any further ado, we will move to a short presentation and introduction that I will give before we get into our panel discussion. So if we start with, sorry, I'm supposed to be using this. So our slide one, it's on. Do I point here? My slides, it's on, it's on. There. Okay, these are our distinguished panel members. So these are two key publications that have come out in the last few years. The first one is Climate Change and Persistent Organic Pollutants, which we call POPs, Predicting the Impacts. And this is a report by UNEP AMAP expert group. And in that report, we have significant information on the relationship, especially between climate change and persistent organic pollutants, especially in the Arctic region. The second report is one done by the BRS conventions together with Minamata and UNEP. And this is a climate, waste, and climate change in Linkages and potential for coordinated action. Those two publications are important because often the linkages are very complex, also very behind the scenes. It's not kind of in the forefront. And especially in the climate change community, we do not explore those very important and subtle linkages between chemicals, pollution, and climate change. Although climate change itself is a chemical pollution problem, right? Because it's carbon dioxide, which is a chemical, methane, which is a chemical, or most of them coming from industrial processes, combustion processes, and other kinds of chemical processes, as well as, of course, releases from nature. So at the end of the day, we're talking climate change is actually a chemical pollution issue when we sum it up in that way. Now, the chemical industry itself is the third largest industry sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and contributes to the global demand for fossil fuels. Now, this is inevitable because everything that the chemical industry produces either ends up as consumer products or other kinds of products that we use. So the demand for cars, for furniture, for housing, for construction, for transportation, all these sectors depend on the chemical industry and the products that come out of those. So at the end of the day, you can imagine that the whole sector really is quite an important sector when it comes to discussing climate change issues and the link with the chemical industry. I was supposed to have a graph, but it's not coming up. It's okay. I'm supposed to have a graph here, Marilyn. It didn't come up. It's okay. No worry. Now, there's two ways of looking at this. Climate change amplifies the releases of those chemicals, but also those chemicals also amplify climate change. Of course, so there's both ways. Now, I think we more or less know how the chemical industry and how the production industry amplifies climate change, and that is the basis of the discussions here. But then when we look at how we deal with chemicals, especially when it comes to waste, when it comes to spent chemicals, when it comes to emissions from chemical industry, there the connections are less obvious. And I'll just give you an example. For example, we have persistent organic pollutants in the environment, which uh, accumulate in the environment. But then when it comes to the ice environments, these chemicals are frozen. But then when the ice melts, those chemicals are mobilized and are taken up by wildlife and they accumulate in wildlife. And then, of course, for example, the Inuit who also hunt for food, these then accumulate in their bodies. So we can see here a direct relationship between the effects of chemical pollution and the effects that climate change is causing. The other one is, of course, when we look at migratory species. Migratory species also migrate from one region of the world to another. And if they come from a polluted region, then these chemicals are absorbed. And as you know, migratory species build fat for them to be able to migrate long distances. And fat is one of the what do you call it, most insoluble part of the body, which means that chemicals get stored in there and they are not mobilized to cause an impact to the animal. But when they start their migratory move, then they have to melt this fat for them to get energy. And this is when those chemicals then enter into the wildlife. And of course, then they enter into our food chain because many of these migratory wildlife, including fish, seabirds, and whatever, they feed on the food web, and then we consume those products. So just giving you two examples where impacts on climate change, the impacts of climate change actually exacerbate the climate change, the chemical pollution issue. And of course, I could go on with ocean acidification and its relation to mobilization of chemicals, chemical pollution in muds and all this, but I will stop here. Otherwise, we'll be giving a chemical lecture. Next slide. You're switching over to the other slide. No, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. Not yet. Okay, well, the point I was making while just loading the slide is that the complexities of the linkages between chemicals, waste, and the climate change is actually very, very closely linked. But because the research is still ongoing, there's more research that needs to be done, there's more assessments that need to be done. So only now we're beginning to see clearly how those linkages are and how the effects of pollution can also be amplified as a result of climate change. I think we're still not there. So I'll keep on talking. Another example that we can think of is, of course, when we have a polluted environment. It's ready. Perfect. Okay, the next one, this one. So this is a diagram that probably you're familiar with because it's climate change diagram. But if we look at different areas where we have the impacts of climate change, whether it's the melting of the ice in the mountains, in terms of or in the Arctic, in the polar regions. All these create opportunities for chemicals to be mobilized further into environment. And of course, this has an interface with biodiversity. And of course, we have an interface with biodiversity because we depend on agriculture and fisheries and all these things for our livelihood. So these are some of the pathways in which chemicals enter the human food system, but also exposure to some of these chemicals, which can actually occur not only in the regions where they are produced, but in faraway regions such as the Arctic, and of course in the small islands as well, which are far from the main centers of industry. So climate change induced changes as increased temperature, salinity, and acidity impact exposure to chemicals may increase the toxicity of this exposure. I mentioned ocean acidification in the contaminated marine sediments, and we talked about a study also that showed that an organophosphate insecticide was 30 times more lethal in the salmon due to changes in salinity. So just changing in one environmental factor, which is as a result of melting ice, more water into the sea, which means that the salinity goes down, and that changes the mobilization of that particular toxic chemical into the environment, especially in this case into the salmon. So pollution makes species already struggling due to climate change even more vulnerable. So which means now we're seeing now another layer of stress on those species. Yes, we talk about the impacts of climate change on those species in terms of access, for example, the polar bears, access to their food, acclimatization, reproduction, and all this. But then we superimpose then the impact of pollution and chemicals. And of course, the situation then becomes far more worrying than it is now. So I've talked about some of the linkages just to create a bit more awareness around this, but I think it's important to really reflect on how we can move forward. And I think one of the most important message I want to share with you this afternoon is that reducing pollution contributes to addressing climate change. So we need they are very much connected. So when we reduce pollution, we actually contribute positively to the climate change issue. And for me, that's a very fundamental and important understanding. And of course, that doesn't mean we stop producing, but we stop pollution. And I think there are two different things. And it's important because when we talk to industry, when we talk to stakeholders, I think it's important that, yes, we need to continue to be able to live. And that's a reality that we face today. But how are we doing it? Are we doing it in a sustainable way? Are we reducing pollution? Are we reducing the impact of pesticides? Are we reducing the leakages of plastics in the environment? Are we reducing the amount of mercury, for example, coming from energy production facilities? What are we achieving in this process of ensuring that we can survive also as a species? So secondly, greenhouse gases and hazardous chemicals are often released from the same sources, such as chemical industry production and use, electricity generation, like, for example, coal-fired power plants emitting mercury contaminants and sulfur and others, cement and metal production. All these are energy-intensive industries. So when we have such situation, it means that we can then look at how we can derive co-benefits or co-opportunities. When we address technology transfer or research and development for addressing climate change, we can also help to address chemical emissions or pollution emissions. So I think there's a great opportunity here for us not to disconnect the two, because I think there are great opportunities when it comes to investment and research and development that we look at those two very closely. Thirdly, sound chemicals management through the life cycle. And this is a thinking that has really come to the fore in the negotiations now for international plastics treaty, where we've seen that we cannot solve the problem just by looking at the end of the pipe, at the pollution. We need to look further upstream, better design, better thinking in the way products are used. So I won't carry on because we're running out of time. Mitigation strategies also include, for example, if we are upgrading electricity grid to deal with renewables, we found that they need to change transformers. And in transformers, in the old transformers, we have what we call PCBs, which are persistent organic pollutants. So can we do that together as synergistic action? And finally, increasing the knowledge, bridging and articulating integrated solutions will, in my view, provide a common frame for us to advance and address the issue of pollution and climate change together. So I hope I've given you a very quick overview. Sorry, I've been speaking a lot, but I just wanted to really share that there are very, very close linkages between the two. So let's move on now to engage our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. And the panel one is on integrated solutions for sound chemicals management and for tackling climate change. So my first question is the minister online? The minister is online. Okay. I would like now to invite the Minister Yordanov to please tell us how the Republic of Moldova is jointly implementing the Paris Agreement and the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm and Minamata conventions at the national level. Minister, over to you.
Hello to everyone. Do you hear me well? Yes, I understood this. So I'm very happy to be today in the first day next to such important event and to discuss also very important issue and also to find the common solutions on the topics and ideas which you raised a little bit above. So in order to implement simultaneously the international agreements which you just mentioned, and developed in response to the challenges to climate change and hazardous chemicals, I would like to acknowledge the interlinkage between the chemicals, waste, and the climate change. Understanding this connection is crucial for developing integrated strategies that address both environmental challenges. Particularly, I would like to point the ones relevant to Moldova as country within the economy in transition. So first of all, I would like to mention that as a minister, we are working on developing the policy documents, and we succeed to approve recently the new legislation on uh, adaptation to policy documents on adaptation to climate change. Also, we approved the new policy document on development with low emissions. And next week, we will approve the new policy document on waste management. So in all these three documents, we took in consideration the international treaties. We also took in consideration all the relevant measures which we assume as engagement at the international level. And also we are working quite hard to also bring operators, authorities, local authorities in the area of environmental protections and also to avoid the climate change footprint and also to solve the issue which we emphasize in the Republic of Moldova. So if you allow me, I just would like to mention several um, crucial points which are very important for Moldova and also where we are working quite hard. First of all, this is the connection between chemical waste management and methane emissions. Improper disposal and management of chemical waste, particularly organic waste, can lead to the generation of methane, a potent greenhouse gas. So the landfill and wastewater treatment process are common sources of methane emissions linked to chemical waste. So for this reason, we are working at this moment in establishing the roadmap at the national level for the wastewater treatment processes and also for the um, developing the modern sustainable landfills and to reduce the quantity of the waste in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Waste incineration and greenhouse gas emissions, this is another issue which is quite important to be tackled and also to be discussed. So incineration of certain types of waste, including electronic waste and plastic waste, can release greenhouse gas emissions such as CO2. We all know about this. So integrating more sustainable waste management practices can mitigate such kind of emissions. So in this world, we are working on reducing the uh, electronical and electrical waste. So in the Republic of Moldova, we created the system of extensive responsibility of the producer, and we have quite nice results already in the collecting all the waste equipment, electronic and electrical equipment. So we are working in the process of collecting. We established the target at the national level. So also we will continue to work on identifying the solutions for the waste to avoid avoid any cases of incineration. So another issue which is very important to be also discussed, and we are working on this component, is deforestation and chemical use. So all of us are aware that deforestation is often the results of the expansion of the agriculture, and also the fact that in the agriculture, the farmers are still using the chemicals. So pesticides and fertilizers used in agriculture release nitrox oxide and other pollutants that contribute to climate change issues. So in this regard, we are applying to avoid such kind of situation. We are working applying the best agricultural practices elaborated and promoted by FAO, and also we, together with the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Industry, we are working on reducing the quantity of pesticides and fertilizer use, and also we are creating the national legislation in this regard. Another issue which is important to be mentioned is also the circular economy and climate mitigation issue, which is very important. We are working on this component. We elaborated the new program on greening the small medium enterprises, and we dedicated quite a lot of actions and measures and attentions to the process of developing the circular economy in the Republic of Moldova. So transition to a circular economy where the products are designed for reuse, recycling, and resource efficiency can reduce the demand of the new chemical production and decrease the associated greenhouse gas emissions. So for this, it's quite important to have all the policy, legal, and financial instruments in place, and also to have the legislation enforced. And also, it's very important to mention that, and I mentioned a little bit about that, it's very important to have the public awareness and education as a main component in promoting the implementation of all three international treaties, and also not only in the area of authorities of or local authorities, but also to involve as much as possible operators to through the raising awareness about the interlinkage between the chemicals, waste, and climate change. We are sure that the consumers will have a better choice and encourage sustainable practices in both production and in consumptions. And also we will reduce the amount of the waste, and also will have more nice example, strong example in application of the principles of green economy and circular economy. So integrated actions that consider the interconnection between chemicals, waste, and climate change can provide synergy and co-benefits. We already realize this, and also can contributing to more effective and sustainable environmental management, and not only at the national level, but also at the operational level and at the level of small medium enterprises. So Moldova is working on coordinating implementation of these international agreements, and like other countries, because we are in the process of discussing, gaining information, sharing the experience and lessons from our neighbors and also from our colleagues from Eastern Partnership. So we have the potential and possibility to develop and approve also the documents which are very, very important for us. So I'm speaking about the second national determined contribution as a part of the commitment for the Paris Agreement. And also based on this national determined contribution, the country will establish the strategy for mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions, and also to identify the measures for adaptation to climate change. And also the national policy framework on chemical management that was approved in October 2023. For sure, this is a strong example of synergy on implementation and policy coordination between three conventions. I mean, Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention. And also we already implemented several activities under Minamata Convention, and we will put and we are adding the provisions of the Minamata Convention also in this policy document on chemical management. So I would like to mention that the issue related to hazardous waste chemicals, just to finish the idea, that the issue related to hazardous chemicals waste, ensuring proper handling, transportation, disposals of hazardous substance are very important. We need to continue to work on this issue. We need to develop the capacity at the national level. We need to have very strong enforced regulations and legislation. And for sure, we will need to allocate more awareness activity and also more financial on this regard. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I will continue to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for this very detailed presentation about what your country is doing. We appreciate that very much. We now move because we have a limited time here in this room. Otherwise, we're going to be kicked out, I have heard. So, Mr. Nicola Rega, from the perspective of ICCA, what are the efforts that the chemical industry is doing to address the issue of both climate change as well as chemical pollution?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much on behalf of ICCA for the invitation. I think it's important to have this conversation and to do it also in a context in which we can look from different perspectives and with I would say the end point is to work together to find solutions. ICCA is the voice of the international chemical industry, and as such, we have been already committed to Paris Agreement and to get to carbon neutrality by mid-century. So that is not a non-negotiable part from our side. I will say the issue, of course, is complex. I will try to split into two parts. One is what are we doing in reducing carbon emissions and what are the co-benefits in terms of the broader environmental agenda, and then what are we doing for the broader environmental agenda? What are the co-benefits in terms of climate change? Otherwise, we won't get out of the room in a few minutes. On the climate change agenda, our companies are already investing in new solutions and technologies that are there to reduce our carbon emissions, but also looking at our feedstock and how can we contribute. So on the direct emissions, we are looking at electrification of our production processes, carbon capture and storage, uh, um, uh, hydrogen as a solution. We are looking at all the possible options. Yet we are also looking at how can we address our dependency from fossil fuel use and how can we find alternative feedstocks. So we are looking at bio-based chemicals. We are looking at enhancing more recycling, not only mechanical but also going to chemical recycling. Whatever we manage to get to prevent from going to waste incineration, I think it's a major benefit. And yet, if things go to waste incineration, we try to recuperate the CO2 emissions because that is carbon. Carbon is a feedstock for us. So how do we bring it back in the loop so that we can have a sustainable carbon cycle in our economy? We are now mapping our investments across Europe, across the world. We are almost there, but we have already mapped something like 130 projects that are from the construction phase to the implementation. So the real projects, not the ones that are only on paper. The mapping will come out online relatively soon, and then the plan is to keep having updated so we can also have a pull effect for the ones that are behind to make sure that we have all the mapping there. We're also working to all the sectors of the chemical industry across the globe to work for a global roadmap to help us identify what are the pathways to get to carbon neutrality, mindful that different regions have different possibilities, different obstacles, different resources. We try to find a way to find multiple paths that will help all of us to move forward. So I think this is an important part in addressing our own direct impact on climate change, and also by looking at our feedstock, also it's a way of preventing other unnecessary impact on the environment. Now, of course, we are also looking beyond our own emissions at what is called scope 3. So what is happening with the product that our customers are using, and the customers, our customers, and the customer customers. So how far do we go in making sure that we have the full picture of what is the impact of our product on the environment? Now, we as a chemical industry, we contribute quite substantially to climate change, but actually also in a positive way. With our product, we are contributing to the transition of the energy industry. Just to make a reference to the improvements on the solar and photovoltaic industry, there's also thanks to the innovation in the chemical industry. And now we're working with them also on the recyclability of their components so that we don't create an additional problem for the environment. I'll leave it for the transport sector.
Circularity.
Yeah, absolutely. Circularity, it's absolutely key. And like, so this is already with scope 3, we are entering into now the secondary part of the second part of the conversation, which is the broader impact on the environment, and how do we address that, the impact of our products, and what kind of co-benefits we can see also in terms of climate change. Now, few months ago, there was in Bonn, there was an important conference about management of chemicals, and already before the conference, the ICCA took a commitment by 2030, three commitments actually. One is to look at the whole portfolio that we have through a framework such as a portfolio sustainability assessment, which is looking at the all impact throughout the life cycle of our products on the environment, on the economy, on social dimension, and to report on what you're finding, so that it becomes a constant engagement in moving forward and to learn from each other. Also, we took a commitment to support 30 countries to implement effective chemical management systems. We already have experience in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. We are trying to put this at the service of other parts of the world so that we don't reiterate the same mistakes from the past. And also, we are adding more transparency to safety and sustainability from our reporting, so it becomes also a part of the contribution we can have in terms of moving together. Because we are, as you were mentioning, we are facing tremendous challenges from the environmental point of view. This cannot be addressed in isolation. So it's important for us to work together with all partners to help us removing the bottlenecks that prevent us from moving forward, but also to work together in reaching the UN goals of sustainable development for the whole community.
Thank you, Mr. Riga. Certainly very important points. And of course, mentioning the issue of transparency, there's definitely areas there for synergies, not just reporting on climate change, carbon intensity and all this, but also on the chemical aspect as well, and can be done together, right? We can explore. And that, of course, will be simpler for industry instead of doing 10,000 reports and having a more harmonized framework in which to report on the sustainability issues. I'm very happy you raised that point. And of course, now we move on to Ms. Ruth Couto, who's going to be talking to us about something that an initiative that UN is doing in the e-mobility area. And I've always said we have an important opportunity now to do it right, because we have both the thinking, I think the political will, and also the industry will, not to reinvent the mistakes of the past. So what are we doing now not to reinvent the mistake of the past, especially with this new emerging technology, which is, of course, electric cars and e-mobility? Over to you.
Thank you very much. And that's a very interesting discussion, and I'm very pleased to be here to talk about that. I come from the chemical sector kind of thing. I'm a chemical engineer by training, and I've worked on these for many years in Brazil in the past. So the energy sector is actually the transport sector is responsible for 1/4 or more of emissions today. And electrifying the transport sector is, of course, one of the IPCC solutions to reduce emissions. And I think that we always think about innovation and how innovation can drive and technology. And this thinking is always driving us to other technologies. And then we have the not the mistakes, but the issues that we have to face. For instance, immobility is very important. But then we have the batteries, and the batteries do have chemical concerns, right? And if they are not properly then dismantled, then recycled, then disposed of, they will cause pollution. But let me step back. If this is part of the solution, let's think about how many additional vehicles will be added to the fleet in the global south. It's predicted that by 2050, 1 billion additional vehicles will have to be added to the fleet in the global south. Probably most of them electrified. What does it mean? It means that the current vehicles that have combustion engine will be probably dismantled or imported to other countries because this is the drive of Europe or Australia, Japan, the US. And we will see in countries like Kenya, for instance, importing these used vehicles, being them old e-vehicles or normal, motor vehicles. And they will have a shorter lifetime because they are already old vehicles. And if the countries do not have proper governance on the import of used vehicles, they will have a burden of the disposal of these. And the Basel Convention has been thinking about that and working towards not a transferring the burden. So you innovate in the north, but then the burden of the disposal comes to countries that do not have strong governance. But there are best practices out there. And I think the Basel Convention has been very good in doing that. But it's not that easy for some countries to build that capacity. When we saw the transition for LEDs, for instance, LED lamps. And our colleague from minister from Moldova was talking about extended producer responsibility. It's much easier to take a lamp with mercury to a supermarket and have industry collect that. When you have an import of a used vehicle, it's very difficult for the for the car industry to have that responsibility on the dismantling. So there is a very important aspect, and the regional Basel centers can have a role to help countries with the governance and facilities to dismantle used cars and batteries and begin to think of how to avoid the errors of the past through the recycling of these batteries, right? But the recycling of the batteries have to be taught upstream because if this is not put into the design of the batteries, they then cannot be properly actually dismantled. So there is a very strong role in the battery manufacturing to allow circularity. So enabling reuse, enabling circularity, enabling this, it's already mined, this metal, right? We don't need to mine again. So we can recover these metals, but we have to design this properly. The other thing is to equip countries with proper knowledge on how to dispose. So, for instance, e-batteries, lithium-ion batteries, if they catch fire, it's very difficult to put down that fire, and therefore they cannot be transferred in terms of waste. So they will have to be first dealt with within the country to be able then to be dealt outside in a recycling facility. So, for instance, Ghana has been the door for e-waste, right? But if countries like, I would say, Gambia, for instance, they have e-vehicles, they will have first to deal with the battery issue in the country before they can actually transfer this, for instance, for Ghana, so they can actually deal with the dismantling of the batteries. So there is a movement and a whole need to look into these issues of used vehicles and used batteries, etc. And that's why in our e-mobility program that we have been spearheading in UNEP together with support from the European Commission and also the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, we have been supporting more than 60 countries to put together their e-mobility strategies. And of course, we're focusing on public transport, 2 and 3 wheelers, and etc. And how actually to take people out of their private cars, but to electrified fleets. But we, in the first program that we had, we didn't have that upstream thinking of how the issue of batteries could be dealt with and end of life of vehicles. But at this point in time, we have a second phase. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, is to look into this upstream part and how countries can deal and how we can, within the program, support. So we're establishing best guidance, practices, and we're putting a community of practice in the regions so these issues can be discussed. And we're also working on some pilot countries, like for instance in Rwanda, that wants to establish some governance and some knowledge on how to dismantle the batteries, etc. And we're also beginning to put together a partnership for dealing with the end of life vehicles and batteries. There's not only the batteries that are the problem in cars. We have flame retardants also in plastics, right? In the dashboards and other parts of the car, which is not a bad thing because we don't want the car to get on fire and we don't want to be burned, right? But at the same time, this has an onus when we are dismantling these cars and before they are crushed. All these issues have to be dealt with, and there is a lot of work that needs to be done to build capacity. And the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, the BRS, has been doing an enormous amount of work and good work to actually work with the countries to do that. But this awareness raising needs to be further wide, outreached and widespread, so this knowledge can be dealt with. So just to conclude, I know we're running out of time. I have a lot to say, but I'll try to be brief. So the program is out there. If you look, you put a UNEP mobility program on the website, you will see there is a lot of knowledge that is that can be derived from there. And I think just 3 points to conclude. If we recycle more, that's one of the lessons on how not to repeat the mistakes. We'll have to mine less. And the issue now is critical minerals, right? How we're going to deal with this transition to renewable energy that really needs so many minerals that need to be mined. And there is issues with cobalt, with nickel, with lithium, and this mining can cause also environmental problems. And there is the geopolitical issues, e-mobility is really focused and very well developed in China. China is one of the countries that have more e-cars in the world. And at the same time, there is a lot of technologies like solar that are developed within China, but all the mining, all the materials that are needed are in Congo, are in Africa. And this concentration is a danger issue for geopolitical reasons, because we see that conflicts sometimes they pop out, and then when you think that something is going to actually be positive, it becomes a negative, and you have to internalize these externalities. And the last thing is that if we think about more circularity from the onset, we can have more jobs and benefit more people. So I think you had in your last slide a lot of very good solutions that I fully subscribe, and I think these are where areas that we should really work together, because they have triple benefits. They have benefits for the environment, they have benefits for the climate, but they have benefits for the people, and that's what I think is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I mean, as you've seen, we've dealt at the beginning with the science through the presentation I did. Then we looked at what industry is doing and what are the linkages. Then we've looked at what is a practical example of what we can do, especially in terms of looking at circularity. And now, of course, I'm getting to you, Lisa, because this is a very important. They are in the front lines. The Inuits, the small island states, all these people are in the front lines. And unfortunately, they are bearing the brunt of the impacts because chemicals travel thousands of kilometers. They're not restricted. Pollution travels thousands of kilometers. Climate change as well knows no borders. So that's one thing that we will say we have in common. And Lisa, can you describe to us what's happening? What are the initiatives? and how this indigenous knowledge can help us understand and also address some of the challenges that we have in
Yes.
linking climate change and the chemicals issue together.
Yes, I'll be happy to. And thank you so much for inviting me to do so. And thank you for the introduction. Um, uh, I'll put it, straight to examples of what we consider indigenous knowledge at home, because we live in the Arctic and our lifestyle is very different from other cultures. We depend on marine mammals, we depend on ice for our highways and snow, and our whole culture is around that snow and ice. We have specialized language around all of that, and that's part of our knowledge. We know the marine migration patterns. We know where they go to, and what we can depend on for our happy foods. Now, even today, our pregnant Inuit women are told by medical professionals, while you are pregnant, don't eat the fish that you are so used to, and they have to wait for months and months before eating that happy food, normally food that is considered just really healthy food for us. But when they're pregnant, no.
Canned foods. They probably resort to canned foods and
Yes,
processed food,
store-bought
which is not
food.
healthy.
That's right, which do not even come from from us. Other examples are, explaining mercury concentrations in whitefish in Nunavut, for example. The count of mercury was lower than expected. And why was that? Inuit harvesters of fish observed and knew that whitefish went out to the sea, which was not known by scientists. And so that was one of the reasons why they had lower amount of mercury in them. Um, Another typical cultural thing is um, Inuit women had less selenomine in their blood. Research showed that the selenomine is a protective compound against the negative impacts of mercury. Now, knowledge holders explained that this could be connected to only women eating um, the tail of the beluga. Culturally, the tail of the beluga is reserved for Inuit women only. And so the researchers found that that was indeed an explanation. Yes. So it's very interesting that we hold these types of knowledge that can be tapped into by scientific knowledge. By scientific researchers. We do consider our knowledge as a science as well. And in working together, we can find solutions together. But let me share with you who we are basically. We are 180,000 Inuit living in the circumpolar region, and we share very similar culture. And um, we have vast knowledge, not just of migration of animals, not just of sea ice, not just of snow, but our lands, our lakes, our valleys, and all are connected to our language as well. But um, so the basis of that culture and our connection to the land is the basis of our knowledge. And also, let me share with you how we define Indigenous knowledge, if I may. Um, it's a systematic way of thinking applied to phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. It includes insights based on evidence and acquired through direct and long term experiences and multi generational observation, lessons, and skills. And it has developed over millennia and is shared from generation to generation. So we do use this definition, but there are other forms of definitions as well by indigenous people and even among Inuit too. But When our knowledge is used equitably, ethically, and with our engagement, then solutions can be found for these climate change impacts and introduction of pollutions that don't know boundaries. They cross all around the world. And for us who don't create those chemicals, it's a pretty serious impact. It's impacting our women and our lifestyles.
Thank you very much. Thank
Ilari.
you for linking climate change with the birth of of a people and the continuous intergenerational, not only passing of this knowledge, but also passing of healthy genetics and
Yes.
healthy food and healthy environment. And this is threatened today. Obviously we've talked about this within a climate change context in the past, but we've never really brought in the chemicals interface. And of course, the Inuit people also want to have all the comforts that we have: mobile phones,
Yes,
television,
that's right.
immobility, right? And we have to think about also chemicals management, the capacity of those people to be able to manage the products, or that they bring in, the waste that is generated. So we've observed, for example, under the Stockholm Convention, the increase in local POPs. We've been measuring transboundary POPs for many years, but we've picked up locally present persistent organic pollutants in the circumpolar region. And this is as a result of poor waste management and poor chemical management within your systems. And of course, we cannot expect you to do this overnight, right? You've not been dealing with chemicals for thousands of years. You've been dealing with nature-based approaches, nature-based solutions, nature-based survival and livelihood, not the
That's
modern
right.
aspects.
That's right.
And that transition or that interface, I think, is important to highlight here, not only in the climate change context, but also in the chemicals and waste context. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of our time. This has been really exciting. This is the first such event we've organized here at the Climate Change Corp, and I hope it has helped to build those bridges that somehow we take for granted that exist between those two or three, let's say three important sectors. But before we finish, I would like to invite my colleague, the Executive Secretary of the Minamata Convention, who's joining us online, Mrs. Monica Stankiewicz, to give us some closing remarks or from her perspective, and also from this event. Thank you. Over to you, Monica. Are you online? Yes, there you
Yes,
are.
I'm online. Thank you. Good day, Madam Minister, Ralph, distinguished panelists and participants. So, first of all, sincere thanks to Rolf and all the panelists for your insightful presentations. It was really a pleasure to be with you and listen to you. I represent the Minamata Convention on Mercury, which addresses the entire life cycle of mercury, and that is primary mercury mining, mercury trade, its intentional use in products, manufacturing processes, and artisanal and small-scale gold mining, unintentional emissions and releases and mercury waste. And at every step of this life cycle, there are linkages to both climate change and biodiversity loss. As Rolf mentioned in your opening remarks, the BRS and Minamata Convention Secretariats jointly published a report on these matters, and that was really a start of our work to explore linkages and to establish new partnerships to address the climate change, biodiversity, and pollution. And in addition to the effects of climate change on chemicals pollution, and give you an example of mercury emitted from permafrost melting. This report and these joint activities also identify synergies in a number of areas, and I would like to reinforce some of the messages that you, Rolf, have already presented in this regard. And firstly, mercury and other chemicals emissions result from fossil fuels. Coal combustion is the second largest source of mercury emission globally, and mercury catalyst is used in vinyl chloride monomer production, which coal is used as feedstock. So reducing the use of coal has a co-benefit of decarbonization and pollution reduction. Common data for fossil fuel use can be used for emission inventories of both greenhouse gases and chemicals. Secondly, energy efficient products also have co-benefits of reducing hazardous chemicals. Let me give me another example. At the recent Minamata Convention conference of the parties just a few weeks ago, parties decided to phase out all types of fluorescent lamps, irrespective of the amount of mercury they contain, and switch to mercury-free and more energy-efficient LED lighting. And I'm glad to hear from Minister Yordanov about efforts to explore and realize this kind of integrated approach and synergies at the national policy level in Moldova. Mr. Rega, we heard about industry's efforts to address environmental impacts of its operations, including reaching carbon neutrality in the future, and to look into greenhouse gas emissions associated with the value chain of the product and impacts of the products themselves, and beyond the direct emissions from the industry. Climate and chemicals conventions also take this full life cycle approach, covering the whole value chain, so we can learn from each other how to address this, also to address these indirect emissions. Ms. Cotta presented a holistic approach to e-mobility, including pointed to capacity challenges facing the developing countries, end-of-life products ending up in the developing countries, posing pollution risk unless waste is recycled and managed in an environmentally sound manner. And this specific issue and that kind of challenge is actually common to all multilateral environmental agreements, and we look forward to mutual and synergies in capacity building efforts. Ms. Koparkwaluk highlighted the importance of indigenous knowledge and its use for addressing the challenges we discussed today, the vulnerability of indigenous people to impacts of climate change and impacts of mercury and hazardous chemicals due to their dependence on natural environment and the traditional diet is well recognized. Still, more needs to be done to address this risk. And I'm very pleased that our recent Minamata Convention conference of the parties adopted a decision on the effects of mercury on indigenous peoples and on local communities, calling for broadening the involvement of indigenous peoples in the implementation of projects and programs under the Minamata Convention. So today's session, I believe, demonstrated the huge opportunities for integrated actions addressing decarbonization, detoxification, which when realized will also alleviate the pressure on biodiversity and will have positive impact on human health everywhere, and especially on the health of those who are most vulnerable to climate change and pollution, such as indigenous people, women, and children. And to conclude my closing remarks, I would like to invite all countries and other stakeholders present here to further consider and act upon the linkages we have identified today in your efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change, but also to reach the goals of the chemicals conventions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Monica, for this fantastic summary. And as you can see, we only touched the tip of the iceberg. There's so much to unpack when we start looking at both those issues of chemicals and waste and climate change under the microscope. I hope this serves as a starting point for us to start working together, for us to explore those linkages, but also those synergies and opportunities so that we can address both detoxification and decarbonization, which are now my two best friends, shaking hands. So thank you so much, and thank you all for making time. Thank you for our online participants as well. Thank you. I'm sorry we don't have time for some questions. We have a very tight slot here, but thank you so much. And you can also post the questions in the chat, and we'll be very happy, of course, to get back to you. So with those few words, a big thank you to our panelists who've been here with me this afternoon, and also our panelists online. And Minister as well, thank you for sharing with us the efforts your country is doing in addressing the solutions, and of course our distinguished participants here and also online. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Thank you.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you very much for joining us at the United Nations Environment Programme Pavilion at COP28. This session comes at the conclusion of Industry Day, where we are going to speak about shaping a climate resilient world for the 21st century. And we are going to specifically look at the role of industry and finance in supporting the adaptation agenda. Please allow me to welcome our distinguished panel. We have here Jessica Troney. She's Senior Adaptation Portfolio Manager for the UNEP GEF projects. Jamping Tia, or JP Tia, is Lead Economist from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I am very pleased to welcome Corinne Svensson, the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Volvo Group, Volvo Sweden. Faustin Moniatikwi, Deputy Director General of the Rwanda Environment Management Authority. We are very pleased to have you with us. We've also got Amit Kar. He's the Global Director of Digital Solutions in Schneider Electric. And from Ghana, we are very pleased to welcome Antwi Boasiako Amoa, Acting Director of the Ghana Environmental Protection Agency for Climate Vulnerability and Adaptation. And let us start the discussion where we will look at the imperative for adaptation action globally, but with focus on Africa. And we will also look at what is required from government, what kind of policies, what kind of incentives in order to attract foreign direct investment, in order to attract a technology revolution in these countries. And then we're going to ask industry what's in store in terms of the technologies, the solutions they are offering, but also from their perspective, what kind of policies can be a game changer in our journey to combat the climate crisis. So as we reach the conclusion of Industries Day, this session is convened by the United Nations Science Policy Business Forum on the Environment, which is a UN-wide platform administered by the United Nations Environment Programme and very much inspired by UNEP's science and policy action. So without further ado, let us just remind ourselves of some of the facts based on the UNEP science. In its 2023 Adaptation Gap Report, UNEP says that the annual adaptation cost in developing countries are estimated to be in the range of $70 billion, projected to reach $140 to $300 billion by 2030. Industries and financial institutions must play a pivotal role in bridging this finance gap. But at the same time, you can't do that at a loss. It cannot be an act of charity or an act of philanthropy. It has to be real sustainable investment. What would it take to reach that? And more than ever before, the need for foreign direct investment in green sectors to support sustainable structural transformation in developing countries and LDCs is becoming of paramount importance. Global flows in foreign direct investment increased by 30% in 2021, reaching $1.6 trillion. But the distribution remains uneven, with developing countries receiving a smaller share. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Jessica. Jessica, from a multilateral perspective, how can industries and the financial sectors collaborate to address the adaptation finance gap? And to what extent, from your experience working on specific projects on the ground, is the role of industry and private sector integrated into adaptation frameworks at the country level?
That's rather a long question. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. So let me just say that I think it's a partnership. So on the one hand, private sector finance, infrastructure companies, and so on, they have a real interest in mitigating climate change impacts, but they're starting to wake up to it. There's a lot of work going on in terms of financial disclosures on climate change risks. And those bodies are now transitioning into mandated disclosures. It's happening in Europe and the States. And so I think that's a very promising body of work. It's based on science based assessments of risk, which need to happen across the board. It's lagging behind. There's still not enough awareness of the materiality of risk. There's not enough work that's been done on metrics, on reporting. And so all of that work is being taken forward in industry groups. And UNEP FI, the finance initiative, I'm happy to say, is instrumental in those dialogues. On the government side, there's a very big role in incentives and regulation. The Adaptation Gap report shows that there has been an increase of between 9 and 12% on countries developing regulation and incentives, but we're still at quite a low volume. Something like 58 countries have reported using regulations, and 42% of countries have reported using incentives for private sector. So there's still quite a long way to go, but awareness is increasing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'm going to move directly to finance. So, JP, I'm going to come to you and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and tell us a little bit, just to warm us up, about the strategies that AIIB employs to finance climate resilience infrastructure in developing countries. And as we discussed outside a little bit, infrastructure is part of a pivotal discussion. We have a very limited time, really, to discuss such a big topic, but this is why jumping into finance directly is of importance as the conversation warms up. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for having me. I prepared a two-page note, but probably I can't do that. So let me say a few things. I think with the drive towards a global net zero transition, comparative advantage will change dramatically in the world. So what are the things that make a country attractive? Green energy. Fair or not fair, there will be pressures to have a carbon tax adjustments at the border. So green energy has become a source of real comparative advantage. So what used to be a public good has now become a real private good. If you can harness green energy, you will make yourself much more attractive to FDI. Secondly, attracting FDI is important. Infrastructure is important. Having the right policy to attract green FDI is going to be very important. What AIIB is doing? AIIB is helping all our member countries, including those in Africa, to do that. We have invested, for example, in ICT in Rwanda. We have invested, for example, renewable energy for Egypt. We have invested in roads in Cote d'Ivoire. All these investments are to put in place the very basic foundational infrastructure to really integrate Africa into the global economy and attract FDI. Let me finish by saying that a government policy and adaptability is super important. There will be many, many bumps along the road. How countries adapt is going to be super important in the journey. I have more to say, but hopefully later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to you. It's not the end of it. But before that, and as we are warming up, I feel it's really important to get to know each other, right? So I'll go now to Karen Svensson, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Volvo Group. Now, Volvo made many, many commitments in terms of sustainability. So there are two areas I want to cover with you. The first one is to get to know you guys from that perspective. And the other one is regarding your role in adaptation as you see it. And we discussed a little bit the point of view of African countries, and we'll come to that. We have the experts who will be able to tell us whether our assumptions or maybe some of the ideas we heard at quite a high level they resonate with them or not. But let us start by getting to know you a little bit. So, what approaches are you at Volvo implementing in order to achieve the Paris targets?
Yes, thank you so much for having me too. And as you say, we are committed to the Paris Agreement. We are to be net zero by 2040, and that is throughout the value chain. So, to introduce us a little bit, I can tell you if we look upon our value chain, actually more than 95% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from when our products are in use. 4% comes from scope 3 upstream. So that means materials, components going into the vehicles. And then only 1% or even less than 1% comes from our own production or the energy that we put in it. So to decarbonize, we need to put in different types of measures throughout the value chain. And we prioritize our activities, of course, based on what will give the biggest impact. So if we have 95% of the emissions coming from when our products are in use, that's where we will start. And what is the main thing if you want to decarbonize those types of emissions? That is to electrify. So today we have a full range of electric trucks available. We also have electric buses. We have sold them for 10 years. And also we have construction equipment machines available electric. And by 2030, we will have 35% of everything we sell to be electric, and that is globally. Upstream, when we talk about materials, and then maybe we come in a little bit to what I see could be interesting for Africa, for example, that is that we are to replace materials and components with either renewable fossil free or recycled materials. So we have worked quite a lot with fossil free steel. A truck is made of the total weight, I think around 70% is actually steel. So this is super crucial. We started a cooperation with the Swedish steel manufacturer SSAB some years ago. And today we have already started to introduce in serious production fossil free steel in our products. And then last but not least, in our own operations, has a lot to do with energy efficiency and creating or changing to renewable energy. Coming back to your point that it's super crucial for us in every facility we have, and we have production in Africa, that there is access to renewable energy.
So how much of a sacrifice is it actually, or is it easy? You are European based, you are, operating globally.
Yeah.
Are you making sacrifices, or does it come easy, or is it profitable? They say green business is good business.
I would say yes. We wouldn't do it if it weren't good business, because of course we are here to make money, but we're also here to do something good. So we think it's absolutely crucial for us to do this transformation. Then it's not easy, and it might not go as fast as we would like it to. And I have a number of things that needs to be implemented in order for it actually to that we should go ahead. But if we talk about, for example, fossil-free steel, we have to pay a premium price for that today. But still, we think it's so important, so we have decided to introduce that into our products. But it's not easy.
So now I'll go to the question that I think will be important for Faustin and for Antwi as we have this discussion. It appears that countries in our continent, in Africa, I'm an African girl from North Africa, so want to leapfrog. This is the language we hear from our leaders. We want to do better. We want technology to be part of our new culture, part of our new economy, part of how we raise the capacity of our young people. And this is not only through multilateral action, not only through international cooperation, but through actual investment. So let me put it crudely, please, Karin. What would it take to get companies like you and Schneider and others in that space, and I'm coming to you soon, to come and invest? We need foreign direct investment. We need manufacturing. We are not only a market, but we are a place to raise our technology capacity. So what would it take, and what are the key barriers? You mentioned already infrastructure. Tell us a bit more. And of course, with JP, we might need to revisit some of that, but after we hear from our member states. So over to you.
So I think if we are to be successful with our transformation, we need to have certain things in place. We need to have vehicles in place. and we have that. They can, of course, be produced anywhere in the world. Right now, they are very much produced in Europe and in US. On top of that, we need charging infrastructure. Today, there is almost no public charging infrastructure for trucks available, so we need that. And in order to build charging infrastructure, there needs to be electricity, and we don't want any kind of electricity. We want green electricity or renewable electricity, so that's also needed. We also need to make sure that it's possible for our customers actually to make this a business, which means that it has to be, to put it simply, it has to be less expensive to drive an electric truck than it is to drive a diesel truck. Otherwise, they won't change. So there needs to be incentives, taxes, or other types of policy measures in place in order to accelerate this. I also feel that there is a big need of harmonization of regulation and policies between regions. And maybe also I would mention competence. I think that's something where we see a big need in order for us to do this transformation.
Thank you very much. Now, Amit, it's your turn. You are the global director, your digital solutions leader in Schneider Electric. And Schneider Electric's expertise in energy management positions it as a key player in supporting environmental goals, doesn't it? So now that comes also with a huge responsibility. So the same more or less questions that Corin answered. So again, two sides of the story. Very quickly, what are you doing to meet the Paris goals, to be part of the solution, one, and two, get directly into the issue of adaptation and being there, being present, being economically active in African states, including maybe some least developed countries. It's very surprising when we hear Rwanda is still in the LDC stage with all its amazing efforts and the visibility that it has garnered through the years, and deservedly so, very active on the international stage. But it's still in the LDCs and hopefully to graduate very soon. So it's an opportunity there, but also understanding the obstacles. So let's start with what are you doing? And then what are you going to do?
Okay. No, so first of all, thank you very much. And I'm honored to be part of this panel. I must say that I'm probably the least expert when it comes to the topics that we're talking about here today, but I'll bring my unique perspective and also the Schneider perspective. I think it's very interesting to hear Corin's story from the Volvo side, because actually I think Schneider is a very similar organization. We are truly committed. We are seen, I think rightly and humbly, but rightly seen as a leader in industrial sustainability, very commonly and regularly ranked as being amongst one of the most sustainable organizations. And part of that is because we made our commitments to the Paris goals, and we're doing everything that we can to stick to them. So indeed, sometimes you have to find a market opportunity to push and a change that needs to be made. Sometimes you do it because it is the right thing to do, right? So, for example, in the Schneider case, we have removed some very intense GHG intense substances out of our manufacturing process, right? So. I may get this wrong, so please forgive me, but I believe that there's a gas called SF6, which is an insulator that we use in some of our electrical equipment. It has many times the global warming intensity of carbon. So we took it upon ourselves to design that out of our system, because we believe inherently in being good and that being good for business. And in fact, what we find is that our customers are responding to that. So when we turn around and we say, you didn't ask us to do this, but we did it, actually that goes down very well. There is I would hope to say that there is a growing movement around people want other people to make the first move, but when somebody makes the first move, people follow, right? And so, it's those kinds of things. We also have a program of Schneider Sustainability Impact, which is various areas of trying to bring a higher level of awareness and understanding and accessibility to green energy, and including training people around the world in various places, various parts of the world, including Africa and Asia, in developing environments, how to look at changing the way we operate to be better about energy management. So indeed, you mentioned energy management is Schneider's heart and soul, And so we're leaning on that experience to really raise up the ecosystem around us. But by the same token, again, we find that that is also good for business because we are selling advanced energy management solutions. So we find that there is a push and pull there that really works.
So, Amit, I want you to tell me a little bit. I don't know if you know the economics of your company by heart, but you're a global operation. You're everywhere. How would you say is the size of your business, say in Africa, for example, or in developing countries in general, compared to your work and investments in the developing world? Is it a difficult one?
So those answers are there somewhere, and
No.
I don't have them. But what I can tell you is that we are very globally balanced, and so our business in Africa in totality would be on the order of billions of euros, right? Our focus really is on two things, which is growth in our what we call green revenue and growth in digital, because we see that those two things go together. Now, our green revenue and digital revenue in Africa is a bit lacking compared to other regions,
Because
just because the maturity of the market is not there yet, right? And I mean, I guess that's one of the reasons that we're here to talk about it, because we do see that as being a focal point for us, and the expectation for growth in Africa in the years ahead for us is going to be higher than in the other regions. So starting from a lower base, but we believe it will accelerate.
I'm going to go to Ghana and Rwanda in a second. But before I do that, can you unpack that a little bit? Can you explain that a little bit more? So if the investment is just a tiny bit less, because or a bit less, we don't have the figures. We need to have the figures, but it is good to understand the why and the how of how we can do better from your perspective and your experience. And of course, digital, according to the UN, to UNCTAD's work, to lots of the work, is pivotal for any effort towards green structural transformation in
Yeah.
the continent.
Yeah, you used the word leapfrogging before, and maybe I have a different interpretation of what that means. For me, it basically means how do you take a bigger step forward, right? So you're getting a better return from the effort that you're putting in. And digital for us is actually probably the biggest accelerator and lever of achieving efficiency and sustainability goals that we have, right? And what I would say is in the current environment with interest rates being historically high, we all know that that's part of the inhibitor around investment, right? If we can if we can encourage a harder look at what digital can do, right? So for example, I'll just give some examples. Schneider has 6 World Economic Forum lighthouse manufacturing facilities around the world, right? So I don't know if, please forgive me if I'm saying stuff you all already know, but a lighthouse plant is, an exemplifier of Industry 4.0 technology, achieving highest levels of efficiency and sustainability that we can expect to achieve today. And we have 6 of them around the world. 3 of them are in developing countries, right? So one is in Indonesia, one is in China, and one is in India. So I think that's an important point around the fact that we can bring world-class digital technology to the right places if the ecosystem around it and the infrastructure around it is amenable to that, right? And I see no reason at all why we couldn't replicate that success in Africa all over the continent.
Thank you very much. Now let me go to Faustin and Rwanda, and then I'll go to Ghana to hear from them, especially in the context of the work with UNEP and with the Jeff. But in terms of Rwanda's the achievement of the 2030 agenda, of the NDCs, how and where do you place industry and finance in terms of the opportunities, in terms of the policies and the steps taken to integrate the power of industry technology into your work? And how do you see the race towards getting more in terms of foreign direct investment?
Thank you. Thank you very much, moderator, for the good question. How, where do we see industries in Rwanda? Rwanda is positioning itself as a green investment destination, first of all. But to be in the position to do that, there are 3 things. One Rwanda has created a conducive law and regulatory framework, which is enabling various investors to invest in Rwanda, especially green investment. To give you some examples, now 2 years back, government of Rwanda took the decision of removing all the taxes on electric vehicles and all accessories. After just 1 year, we saw massive and impressive change. Most of the people were moving from diesel car to electric cars because they were tax free. And some of them they are saying it is our first time to own a new brand car because they used to buy second-hand cars. That's one of the conducive law and regulatory framework Rwanda is putting in place to foster the green investment. Second, Rwanda has placed environment and climate change at the center of our development. We tried to mainstream environment and climate change in all sectors, be it in agriculture, be it in transport, be it in energy. In our Vision 2050, climate change is cross-cutting area where all the sectors need to portray how they are taking into consideration climate change externalities which might affect their business or which, again, business might exacerbate the impact we are facing. Third, uh, access to finance. Uh, Rwanda has established Rwanda Green Fund. Last month we celebrated 10 years anniversary of the Rwanda Green Fund. It was the first national fund which mobilized more than 200 million US dollars just in 10 years. But that fund catalyzed the investment in a way that private sector had a window to get a, a loan which is subsidized. NGOs, civil society, they have a window to get funding for or doing their advocacy to the people, and then government institutions which are also in the implementation. For instance, us in the environment, we are telling Minister of Agriculture or Minister of Infrastructure, for instance, in the transport, when you are building roads, please make sure that you have proper water channels. Make sure that you elevate the road in a way that it will not be flooded, where bridges are not going to be flooded. But then they are coming back to us. We only have money for building roads. Where can we get money to climate proof that infrastructure? So that's where our Rwanda Green Fund comes in to climate proof those infrastructures. Last but not least is technology transfer and innovation. It's very challenging for our young innovators. They don't have access to finance to start, but what we did, we created what we call incubator and accelerator program, where they can come and we incubate their good ideas in terms of green technology, if they have any green technology. After proving their concept, they get seed money from the Rwanda Green Fund, and then they can start. So those are four main elements or ingredients to help a country to embrace green investment. That's why my message starting is that Rwanda is positioning itself as green investment destination. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Faustin, a follow-up question, but I will go to Antwi first, and just for you to think about it a little bit, and then I got back to you. My question is really, we talked about leapfrogging, being able to get the best, the latest technologies so that Africa can be a hub for that, a user, but also maybe a generator of that. And I'll come to the banking sector in a second. But I want to know from you, to do that, these are the companies, for example, that you need to work with. And we talked a little bit about incentives. We talked a little bit about breaking barriers and creating the environment that attracts the investment, the foreign investment to flow. So it's a bit of an economic rather than an environmental, but it's really, really both. But what do you want from them? What do you want from these people? You have direct access to them. Here they are. Here are some of the top industries in the world. What do you want from them? What's your message to them? Not now. I'll go to Antwi, Ghana first, and then I'll come back to you so that you think about it just a little bit. And Antwi, now you are engaged already with UNEP, working with Jessica and others within the GEF project portfolio. So my question really is your vision regarding the benefits of international multilateral cooperation through the Global Environment Facility, through other projects that happen through these systems on the ground to support overcoming vulnerabilities for adaptation. And how do you see that working with or in conjunction with real investment, and especially foreign investment, and the bringing of these latest technologies and investments to Ghana?
Thank you so much, moderator. I think it's always good to speak last, so you get a benefit of hearing from everybody. And mine, I will start from a different angle, looking at, because I want to put this discussion in perspective. So we're coming from an economy where we're trying to enhance or improve the private sector engagement in climate change adaptation. Jessica started very well by telling us that there should be a business case. In fact, she also actually made it very clear. So for a private sector to come into the landscape of climate investment in the country, first of all, there should be a business case. And for mitigation, it's always not difficult to make a case for business. Adaptation is normally seen as a social good. And so what is in for the private sector? That's the first question. Why would Schneider or Volvo or a bank actually come and then invest in climate change adaptation activity in Ghana? And then when we talk of private sector, in my country, it's very convoluted. And so you have those that are the large scale, largely foreign-based companies situated in the country. You have the medium-sized private entity, and then you have the small scale and then small entity, mainly micro, and that is the largest. And then you also have within the private sector, you have the banking sector and then also the non-banking sector, so the insurance companies and so on and so forth. All these are classified in my country as private sector. And these actually have different objectives and perspectives. And so, and flipping it to the people, you have a country that has a population that is largely agriculture based and smallholder. And so, in terms of readiness, where lies the readiness of, because we're talking of leapfrog, we're talking of technology, we're talking of energy solutions. So, where will be the entry point for this? I think this is the starting point of this discussion. And for my country, like what Rwanda actually said, the basis is first of all to make sure that is this country ready? And so there has to be an engagement strategy to make sure that the private sector can be engaged well, because they are from different skills and different interests. Their interests are different, and then the way climate change also affect their businesses or they affect climate are also different. And so the entry points are not the same. So importantly, you need to first of all create the needed awareness by having a policy in place or policies, because depending on what you are doing, there should be some kind of policies. We're talking of standards because we're talking of green investment. For example, investing in a smallholder farmer to use maybe solar technology to generate electricity to power water so that you can do irrigation all year round. This is what the smallholder would need. It is technology. Do they have the capacity to be able to actually adopt this technology and use? And so we need to actually look at the readiness phase first, and then this leapfrogging issue can actually come in. I think that, for me, is the starting point of this discussion.
It's a very good point, and you already raised quite a few questions that I invite Corinne, JP, and Amit to think about, because we'll come back to you on that after we hear now from Rwanda, which is, what's in it for you? Do you find the adaptation agenda attractive? Why should you invest? Why should you consider? So think about it a little bit as we get back to you, and then we'd like to hear from you, Faustin, about really what's your message to.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a tricky question, but I'll try my best. I think from my perspective, we need two things. One, we need trust. Why do we need trust? For instance, Rwanda is the second country in ease of doing business in Africa after Mauritius. You can go to the Google and see. But ranking, it has its own indicators. How do you, the incentive you give to private sector, how people access your country. We have visa free for all the citizens of the whole world uh, upon arrival. All of those are ingredients which are helping to rank Rwanda as the second country in ease of doing business in Africa. But that's why I said the first thing we need from big companies like uh, uh, Volvo, Schneider, and others is that trust. Second, we need uh, beneficial partnership. From your end, you have particular interest, as my colleague said. You want to make money, but from our side, we also want, first of all, to boost our economy, but on the other hand, to make it in a sustainable manner that climate change impacts and other externalities are not shaking the economy, are not shaking your business. So that's why I said we need beneficial partnership where we need a specific and strategic engagement strategy between two partners as partners, but not where one party can think that is going to benefit while another one is not going to benefit. So we need two things: trust and mutual benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think this resonates very well with what Antwi said. Now, what I want to do is first, let me just go to the floor to know, I'm just trying to manage time. Do we have any questions or commentaries from the floor? Okay, so if you do, just show your hand. And what I want to do now is that I will go to our industry partners and friends, and one by one, I want you to respond to the points that were made by Rwanda and Ghana, and also the question that was asked, what's in it for you? How do you see it? Because that will help us. We speak different languages, and in the UN Science Policy Business Forum, the first thing we realized when we first convened in December 2017 is that, oh my God, we are speaking different language between the United Nations, between the business sector and finance, two different worlds, and then governments. And it was really that, oh my, are we going to communicate effectively? So I think we're trying to do that. We've been trying to do that with some success, but it's wonderful. And trust definitely is everything. And trust needs to be built. It needs to be built, and it is very much based on common understanding. So, Corinne, I'll go to you, and then we'll go to JP and Amit. You will have a minute and a half to articulate yourself, and then I'm going to ask Jessica, how do you see within this context the role of the multilateral system? And do you feel that the multilateral system has a role to play? It's a changing world. We are not on track to meet any of the environmental goals the past 50 years. So that says we need to do things bravely, differently, and with a lot of courage. So what needs to change and what is our role? So let's go. Corinne, over to you.
If I would only focus on one thing, then I would focus on what you talked about, the beneficial partnership. I think that's sort of, and also trust, I must say, that's sort of the basis for this whole transformation. So what's in it for us? I think together with different countries, we would like to form partnerships to understand how we better can implement sustainable transport solutions. We are very interested in having an active dialogue with partners like you on how we can develop that. What are the prerequisites needed, but also to have partnerships around creating the enablers. And we feel that we need to step outside our own value chain and also move into other parts of the value chain. So I think if I would keep it short, that's where I would like to focus.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. JP.
Um, Something Amit said about 10 minutes ago struck me, and I think it's important. I think FDI can be anywhere. So the history of Asia, including my own country, Singapore, we developed on the back of FDI. China took in a lot of FDI now, in the past, and now Vietnam, Indonesia is getting FDI. The key is to find a slice of the value chain and work hard at it. And you don't have to make the whole car, but make a parts of the car and start to building for that. I think if Africa country just get some of the basic policies and infrastructure right, it will become a very attractive destination for FDI. Point number two, leapfrogging. A couple of years ago, when I look at the Chinese cars, I don't think that they're as good as Japanese car. I didn't think that they were as good as German car. But today, when I look at Chinese electric cars, wow, eyes easy over the battery, the touch, the computer inside. It has completely leapfrogged, in my opinion, many Japanese and German brands. I bet the Rwanda market is now having a Chinese electric car, if I have to guess correctly, what electric cars are imported. Now, let me conclude by saying, um, in this next wave of FDI, I think China will become an outbound source of FDI and technology and know-how. I think that is where the new opportunities will arise. I think Africa can engage and then find ways to attract this kind of value chain production into Africa. I think it will be very productive. AIB will be here to help by getting in place finance for basic infrastructure and plugging more of these finance gaps to link Africa to the world. Thank you so much.
So I'll have a follow-up question for you, but very quickly. You are surrounded by two of the biggest European companies. Will Europe be able to catch up? Will Europe be able to catch up? What would it take for Europe to catch up? Because, you're right in the middle.
Before the session start, I spoke a little bit to Corinne about electric cars. She assured me that Europe has got electric trucks. So maybe that is a comparative advantage in Europe. It's different segment, but that I hope maybe she answers it better than me. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you very much, Amit.
Well, then there's electric planes coming too, right?
Yeah.
So it's all happening. One of the benefits, I guess, of going last in this section is I can start off by saying I agree with everything that the preceding speakers have said. If I can boil it down to something that I would add that's very concrete, right? So when we talk about what do we need to encourage the investment, right? I lived in Africa as well. I know the potential. I've also lived in parts of Asia. I can see how things have progressed in different ways. So if we're going to build trust and strategic and specific partnership, and we're going to speak the same language, and we're going to identify the sections of the value chain that can be exploited in certain geographies. I think what nations need is a cohesive industrial data strategy, because then you have the ability to address all of those things on a common platform of what people can agree is this is trustworthy. We can act on this, right? We can make designs and strategic and investment decisions on the basis of this. Now, I can't speak for Rwanda, so I don't know. I know that you're a nation that is progressing very, very quickly and has garnered a lot of respect and reputation rightly around the world. So I can't speak for you, and maybe you can tell me. But one thing we do find is where we are successful in really exploiting these public-private partnerships is where there is something like that, a common basis to work on. And because I'm a digital guy, of course, I'm going to say this: a kind of industrial data strategy for the whole nation is a great starting point.
And this is, we are convening around that next year. So keep that thought because we will get there. And UNEP is producing a global environmental data strategy where for the first time we have an expert group that we convene in support of that and that looks specifically into some of these issues and some of these gaps. So let's keep tuned. Your role, Jessica, the multilateral system, its relevance in a changing world.
Well, I think it's really relevant. I mean, that's why we're all here. This is the multilateral process in action. It's relevant for awareness, it's relevant for reaching agreements, it's relevant for raising money for the countries that really need it. The Adaptation Gap Report is very clear in saying that even if we double adaptation finance, it's only going to make a dent in what's really needed. And let's not forget the climate justice angle. So it's very, very relevant. And also, I just want to say that quite often the information exchange and the knowledge exchange is not just south-south or north-south. It's often south-north. I would say, I'm from the UK, but I've lived in Africa for 16 years. I would say that Africa, in many aspects, is ahead of the North. For example, Rwanda was one of the very first countries to ban plastic bags. A lot of the experimentation with nature-based solutions is happening in Africa. I just want to bring the issue of nature-based infrastructure. We did a very good study in Ghana looking at the power sector, the water infrastructure sector, and the potential to integrate natural-based solutions into infrastructure design. This month, we've just produced a report with UNOPS on nature-based infrastructure that says that it offers the opportunity, because trillions of dollars have to go into infrastructure, offers the opportunity to deliver on 79% of the SDG goals. So these kinds of examples and knowledge exchange happen in multilateral circles. And I'm very pleased to be part of working with Rwanda, with Ghana on national adaptation planning, concrete projects in Ghana and Rwanda. And I can tell you that there is a lot happening in those countries. But the main thing is, and I just want to pick up on something that you said, Andrew, the business case. It is absolutely critical. And the role of government in developing that business case and in making it easy for private companies to invest in sustainability, for micro enterprises to grow, it cannot be overstated. So I hope that sort of brings things together. Thank you.
It brings it together perfectly because it looks like the UN Environment Assembly, which is going to be held in Nairobi at the UN Environment Programme's premises in February, with 193 governments taking part, is the highest level decision-making body on the environment globally. It looks like the Science Policy Business Forum might just need to look at the business case for sustainable investment in Africa with your help. So Faustin, Antwi, Corin, JP, Amit, and Jessica. I thank you very much for being such a wonderful panel. And to our lovely audience, it was a pleasure having you. And this brings us to the conclusion of Industry Day and the UNEP Pavilion at COP28. Thank you all very much.